So I'm really a guy who lives out in the woods. Don't have any of those special fancy titles, but I am a father, and I want my children to live in a Christian nation. And I want my children to live in a Christian nation.
All right, welcome to the Lone Bulwark. So that intro, if you thought that was amazing, that intro was made by William Swollis. You can find him on Twitter. So check him out. I thank him for making that. There's another one he made. It's just amazing. So yeah. So follow. I think it's WBS something. I don't know. You guys know who he is. So give him a follow. All right. And so, of course, I'm working with new equipment and software because I'm an idiot. And so if there's anything wrong going forward, people who are in the chat, thank you for, letting me know, hey, Wolf, your sound sucks. So today, what am I going to do on this live edition? I am going to discuss that video that has gotten a lot of views. Discussion between, his name is Chris Gordon and Doug Wilson and Jared Longshore. And I'm going to go through it. So this might be a long video. You can stop it and then watch the rest of it later. If you get bored, you can take a nap, whatever you want to do. Yeah. So I think first of all, it's worth mentioning that this is kind of a first for Doug in a way. It's interesting for how long he has tried to engage in conversation and fruitful conversation with people in the Escondido world. So Chris Gordon, I didn't know who he was, and I still actually don't know who he is. All I know is he has a high production value studio that I'll probably talk about a little bit. But yeah, so but in the Escondido world, that's the Westminster West world. There's people who have in that crowd been very critical of Doug for a long time. And Doug has always been for a long time has said, I'm willing to sit down and talk with you or debate you or whatever it is. And so finally, after decades, Doug is finally able to, have a sit down discussion with these guys. And it was centered around Christian nationalism, post-mill. I was mentioned a few times. And so I thought that I would kind of engage it because I actually haven't, the book came out almost 2 years ago, and I haven't, apart from maybe a few Twitter comments, I haven't actually had a sit-down discussion with Doug about anything except for in the early kind of market promotional stuff we did in the October, the month before the book came out. And so this is an opportunity for me to interact with some things he says and then other things that Chris Gordon says. And there's a lot of interesting dynamics because in a way, in some sense, I'm actually closer to Chris Gordon in some ways, not in the application, certainly not in like ethos, than I am in relation to Doug. So it's very interesting. And nevertheless, I'm more on Doug's side in terms of, let's make things happen. But I give, praise to Chris Gordon because he's probably took some heat from guys. I think he even put out like an essay that essentially listed why he did this, like why he would even sit down with Doug. It's actually kind of ridiculous how people throw out like heresy accusations all day on Twitter. And then Doug's like, I'm not a heretic. And here's why. But then they say, yes, you are. And there's no actual sit down to kind of iron out differences. And that's really the way, you can kind of go back and forth on essays or blog posts or tweets, but in the end, like what is the actual dispute between us is usually something discovered in one-on-one conversation. And then you figure out, oh, that's the actual dispute between us. And oh, by the way, people can come down on both sides of that just as they want. So yeah, thanks for Chris. And he actually reached out to me because I was like, hey, you talked about me a lot. And we might be able to get together in November and have a similar sit down, which would be outstanding. I'll be in San Diego at that time. And I think he's in Escondido, which is about 45 minutes north of San Diego. I've only been to San Diego once, never been to Escondido. But it'll be great to have a sit down with him I'm going to be as ironic as I can possibly be, which is, that's my normal demeanor. And so we'll just have a great conversation. If you guys are in the YouTube chat, please let me, again, audio keeps going up and down. Well, that's not good. Hopefully it'll remain normal. If that continues, let me know. I don't know why. It looks to me as if it's good. Perhaps it's like my noise gate is bad. I could probably change that. Anyway, let's begin the video, and then I'll do some audio tweaks in the middle of that, and we'll get going on that. All right. All right. Thanks. Let's get this in.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for coming to Escondido. This might make some brains explode.
maybe even ours.
Maybe. I anticipate this being somewhat of a lively discussion on some of the issues of our day that have been, well, you're not lively. A stranger to controversy. And some of these issues are really affecting Christians right now, thinking through, well, in a changing culture that has changed so radically in recent years. To deal with some of those issues, I'd like to address some of that, Christ and culture. We'll look some, think about some, and address federal vision, masculinity more. I don't know how we'll do this in the time allotted, but we're going to give it our best shot. So
yeah, they actually don't cover all that stuff.
Yeah, we're going to try. I want to say up front, a lot of these issues are complex. I think that's one challenge for American Christians. We don't like complexity. Mm-hmm. So some of these issues are indeed complex.
Yeah, by the way, you guys are going to have to bear with the fact that it's normal time. I tried to do the speed up function on this, and it made them sound like chipmunks, which I might do at some point for fun. But I was going to do it maybe like 10% faster, but it just would sound ridiculous. I couldn't figure out how to.
You have to think through them carefully. I've done my best to do the reading and to do my best to try to understand them. I've tried to read you as charitably as I can and to try to understand what you're saying and to do it in such a way that I'm fair with your arguments. If I'm not that, I told you up front, you're welcome to say that.
I think one of the ways so Chris keeps saying things like I'm concerned or troubled or whatever. So yeah, we make fun of that on Twitter, but one of the things about all that is that I think he's reflecting probably the conversations he has in Escondido with friends who I'm guessing are in high places. And so kind of interpret it like that. I want to say up front that Doug did have a short blog post saying that we should just kind of calm down and not attack Chris, because this is, as I said, kind of unprecedented to my knowledge. And so we should definitely we should actually thank him for something like this instead of attacking him. You can be critical all you want. I would say and I didn't see a lot of it. I didn't follow some of the Twitter discussion. I said my thing and then kind of dropped out. But I would say that kind of treat him with grace, because really he's doing something that he's probably getting nasty phone calls and emails already. So I would just keep that in mind. Okay, let's keep going.
Many people will question this, I'm sure. I'm really not looking forward to fueling 100 video and podcasts after this with content that are going to tear apart every word. But as I get older, I really don't care. So, I'm gray enough now to know not to worry about it, right? I guess we care to some degree. But there are sides in everything today. And my fear somewhat is that I'll create, by doing this, more confusion. I don't want that. So we want to help people with clarity on these issues. I'm doing this today for that sole purpose, because I care about these issues biblically, confessionally. I want to help Christians through this. This stuff has been weighty on me for many years as a pastor. It's affected me for many years. I'm kind of giving my direction here, but goals here. I'm not trying to win a debate. I'm sure, Doug, Jared, there's no question in light of the many places you have been that I'm going to ask that you've not heard before. Yeah. These questions have been asked, I'm sure, many times to you. I do hope to demonstrate that we can have discussions on these things in a way that is charitable. We're not in a world that treats people with whom we disagree with charitably at all. And that's one of my goals here, to do it respectfully with you. The calling of our Lord, even if I considered somebody to be, even if a radical enemy of the gospel, my call is still to love them.
Right.
That is a call, right? That is a command. So I'm trying to come at this as respectfully as I can, demonstrating that I'm not afraid to be challenged myself on these issues. I don't want to avoid these issues with whom I disagree. I've written a piece that went out critiquing some of your thoughts, Doug. And I believe personally that if you're going to critique somebody, you should be willing to engage them. Not everyone shares that view, but that's at least my conviction.
All right. So what he's getting at there, if you don't know the backstory, is I kind of gave the broad overview, but there are people on his wing, such as Scott Clark, and he has attacked Doug for years. I mean, just decades and decades. And Doug has always responded to Scott Clark as, hey, let's talk, let's sit down. You can come up to Moscow. He said he can go down there. If you want, we can have a debate. We can do it over the internet. We can do whatever. And Scott Clark has always denied that. So that's what he's actually, so I think Chris is actually talking about his own folks, which is, again, nice to hear. I totally agree that his conversation on Twitter, so you can Twitter has its own personality, and generally my policy is that I'm only going to dish it out on people who kind of can dish it back, meaning that, like, if you're going to do these slightly edgy sort of Twitter comments against me or my friends, and I'm going to do it back. And that's just how it operates. In person, you can actually be very different. I tend not to troll people who are not trolled themselves. At least I usually don't. Anyway, this is very good. And I totally agree that if you're going to be able to criticize someone, you should also be able to sit down, especially if it's an obsession over years. You should definitely be more. Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Yeah. So here we are. Well, where to begin? We want to begin with something really controversial. Let's think about Christian nationalism. Let's start there. It's hard to know where to begin. I know you've defined it before, Doug and Jared. I've read more of Doug. I know you have some books out. It's on my list, so forgive me that I'm not as prepared with your writings. So I don't say this in any way to marginalize what you've done. I want to engage you too. So anything that I say here is really to both of you, okay?
Great, very good.
I know you said before, I watched the Tucker interview, and would you define for us again Christian nationalism?
Yeah. Christian nationalism is the recognition that secularism is a failed project. Official state-supported agnosticism doesn't work. It was always false, but there were times when the falseness seemed plausible. So if in Eisenhower's administration, someone said, we Americans can live decent, orderly lives without reference to God, I think that was false then. But at least when you're looking around, it was harder to refute because your neighbors on either side took out their trash on the right day and they drove on the right side of the road and everything seemed to be going along fine. But today, your neighbors are reading Drag Queen Story Hour stories, and on the other side, teenage daughter just had a double mastectomy because she thinks she's a guy. Everything, all the wheels have come off. So for Americans to say today, we can live decent, orderly lives without reference to God is radically false. We've killed 60 million babies. Obergefell has made same-sex marriage the law of the land. You can get fired from any major corporation in America for saying out loud, I think that little boys ought not to think they're little girls. So everything is coming unstuck. So the first thing is that.
So I think first, what Doug hasn't given a definition yet. He's essentially laying out the historical conditions in which something like Christian nationalism has arisen, and I think he's right in this sense that since the 50s and before, I'd say in the 19th century, everyone just kind of assumed that this country was a Christian nation. After the 50s, things started to kind of slide down in that way, and so now it's being revealed to us in real time over the last 15, 20 years that actually secularism is actually detrimental and a negative. Essentially, the neutral world position, as Aaron Rins has talked about it, was a very unique historical condition. It was kind of a post-Christian sort of environment. And now all of that's fallen. We've come under, what Doug calls secularism. And therefore, because of that, it's now being revealed to people's minds that they're in a sort of dogmatic slumber, that the theology they believe, their presuppositions about society was all very much historically conditioned in a neutral world mindset. And I'd argue actually Escondido theology, which is the kind of radical two kingdom theology, is precisely a product of living in a certain era in which Christianity could kind of coexist with sort of non-Christian or even anti-Christian elements, and we could all just get along fine. But what's happened in the last 10 years especially has revealed that that's actually false, that there is a sort of demonic force in society that when you try to create some kind of neutral world or try to live in a neutral world, that is actually not the normal state of things. Historically, that is before the neutral world, even in pagan societies. We'll talk about that later. But also, it's something that was essentially post-Christian, and now it's anti-Christian into a certain negative world environment.
The old gods have failed. The secularist gods have failed. The post-World War II liberal consensus has failed. It doesn't have the ability to hold a people together. That's the first part. The second part is, as Christians, we believe that no society can cohere without an ultimate reference point. And as Christians, we believe that ultimate reference point ought to be the true and living God and not an idol.
Okay.
Right. So that in a nutshell would be my understanding. Two steps. The old gods have failed, and what I'm proposing instead is a recognition of the true God. And after that, when you get to particular policy proposals, it's a matter of debate and exegesis. But the principle is Americans should stop making God angry.
Okay. Okay. A lot to interact with there.
One of the things that that definition to stop making God angry, it's not really a definition. It's also kind of a negative. You usually don't want to define things with negatives. So just stop making God angry. So I'm not a huge fan of that kind of definition. I do agree with the previous things Doug said. But I think we can have and it's more than just I think Christian nationalism is more than just acknowledging the true God. I think you have to bring in some notion of nation, some notion of the nationalism and how that relates to nation, and then how that relates to Christians. So that's my I know he has sort of stock answers, nothing against him on that, but he has some stock answers to that definition. I usually say you can read the more complex definition of my book, but the definition is that it's a nation that acknowledges and understands itself to be a Christian people, that is as a collective entity, say we the people are Christian, and then they, in light of that, act and arrange themselves, order themselves through laws and customs, or just broadly speaking, a way of life that orders themselves to both basic earthly goods and also the heavenly good as well. So within the confines of political order. So that's my definition of Christian nationalism. It involves so it's a nation, but then it also involves the sort of ism involved with that, the nationalism, which is we're going to self-consciously order ourselves to distinctively Christian things. So that would be my definition. I've never seen Doug describe it that way. I don't know if he disagrees with that definition, or maybe his method and approach is different than mine. His kind of base of sources from which he informs his rhetoric is different than mine. But that's how I define it. I think it's a better definition. I think it's actually a definition. And it might be, it's kind of abstract, it's unclear, but it's like that by design. That means that you can have a Hungarian Christian nationalism. You can have a British Christian nationalism. You can have American Christian nationalism. And so, which means there's flexibility for that nation to remain itself, to be that that nation of people with its distinct history and heritage and way of life, but also have order itself to really the universal Christian good. So this idea that a particular thing can then order itself to a universal that is Christianity. So Christianity is not a particular thing. It's not in itself a national thing. It's a universal, I don't know, global thing, I guess. But particular things can order itself to universal. Just like you as an individual, you were born with certain skills, certain proclivities, and that are particular to you. You might not be a good doctor, but you'd be a great carpenter. You might be the best carpenter in the world, but you'd be a lousy, I don't know, engineer or something like that. And so you have this particular individuality, but you can share the same Christianity as the doctor. But you can both order your individual particularities to Christian good. And so just the same way as a family, every family is different, and yet they get that family as a family entity can acknowledge God and order that family life to that universal Christian good. Same thing as a nation. So anyway, well, let's keep going. I'm sure I'll get into more of that as we go along.
Anything to add, Jared?
No, I mean, I agree with that explanation. Secularism is dead. We need some kind of transcendent anchor. We acknowledge that we're one nation under God. So you're simply underscoring that. There's a public civil acknowledgement of the triune God, of the Lordship of Christ. So in some sense, I want to indicate that it's already been done, like it's already present. I don't think that what's being proposed is out of step or like a revolutionary move, something that's out of step with where our nation has been. But it is in.
See, I totally agree with Jared on that this is something people don't realize because they've essentially been in a post-Warren Court era where they essentially think that the American founding and the American political order from its beginning has been secularist, has been sort of neutral, and that it has not been a Christian people with Christian institutions and a Christian way of life and Christian rhetoric in public sphere. This is really, we live in a weird era relative to the rest of American history. So the 19th century, people to be Christian was essentially both normal and expected in some sense. Even in the early 20th century, the progressives we don't like, the progressive theologians and pastors, we don't like their policies and all that, but they use explicitly Christian rhetoric. Essentially, like the social gospel guys were saying things like, we are a Christian people, so why don't we live like that? Now, we'd agree with some of their theology, we'd disagree with their politics, their applications, all those things. We disagree with all that. But the fact that in public, their public rhetoric is an appealing to a Christian people to adopt Christian policies to their mind shows that even the left, in the early 20th century, affirmed that we are a Christian nation. And it really wasn't even in the early, after World War II, Eisenhower and those administrations, Eisenhower in particular, wanted in a way to reassert our Christian heritage because there was a sense in which that was slipping. And then we have what we have today, which is essentially not only neutral with regard to Christianity, but hostile to it. And so I think Jared's absolutely right that if you're going to recover an older America, then that old America is Christian. Now, that's not reflected in the Constitution. We could talk about that. But in terms of the public sense of itself, it was Christian. In the public institutions, they were explicitly Christian. And it's really just been an abuse of the First Amendment through the incorporation doctrine via the 14th that has gotten us where we are today. Essentially, there was a set of men on the Supreme Court under the Warren Court who essentially radically changed our country through just direct ruling. And so, yeah, I think Jared's absolutely right there.
It's an idea in need of renewal. Public acknowledgement of the Lordship of Christ.
We want to revert to American factory settings.
Okay. We're going to discuss that. We're going to discuss that. Before I sort of engage some of those ideas, I'm going to run through just to sort of set the trajectory here. A few comments and to think about. I'll raise an initial concern, but it's going to be kind of fleshed out as we go. Okay. Stephen Wolfe says in Case for Christian Nationalism, which I've read, Christian nationalism is the totality of national action consisting of civil laws and social customs conducted by a Christian nation as a Christian nation in order to procure for itself both earthly and heavenly good. The Christian nation is the complete image of eternal life on earth. Fair enough?
Yeah, I don't differ with that. Well, the complete image, as complete as possible in a fallen world.
Right.
It's not the.
Gotcha.
It's not beyond the eschaton,
yeah.
but as complete as may be.
Yeah, so that's right, and I thank Doug for saying that. So the idea of an image of God is like the thing that being an image doesn't mean it's the same thing as. What I mean by that is that you have in a Christian nation, it's complete as to its fundamental elements. There is a people that worships God, that does Christian things under a Christian civil ruler. Okay, so that's an image in the sense. It is an image in the sense that it's analogous, or it points to, but it doesn't conflate or confound the difference between earth and heaven. It's not conflation of those two things, but it does point to that. So if you see, take a traditional polity under a king. You have a Christian king under which you have subjects or the people. The Christian king orders those people to the highest good, which is to God, and they do Christian things. In that sense, it's a complete image of what heavenly life is like, even though it's not the same thing. It's, as Doug said, it's prior to the state of glory. It's in a state of grace. There's still sin in a material sense. But you can have, like, when you talk about a perfect or a complete nation, you mean it in a formal sense. The elements are there. Just like you as a Christian, as an individual, through the grace of regeneration, have been restored to you the faculties through which you can now acknowledge and worship God. That doesn't, so in a way, you are a complete human being in terms of the restoration of the faculties themselves. You can do formally you have what Adam lost. And what he had, and now you've recovered it. Now, that doesn't mean material or in content of action that you're sinless, that you're perfect, but it does mean you are holy in a complete sense. And that would be what I would call definitive sanctification. And then you have progressive sanctification, which is essentially you aligning the content of your action to the progressively to the faculties or that. So the same thing with a nation. It can be an image in terms of its formal sense because it's relationship of superior to subject. Also, the things you do are Christian. You acknowledge, worship God as a people, and so that's what I mean by complete image. I guess in hindsight, if I think I would have explained that more, but there you go. I explained it there, and that's not me getting around something I said that I wish I didn't, but it's just that's what I meant by it.
Okay. I thought Paul Miller, for some reason, this definition's not sticking for people.
Stephen's definition.
Well, yeah, I thought it's interesting when people try to define things. Stephen's definition is muddy to me. I mean, I get the basic gist of it. It's not hard to get the basic gist. I think Paul Miller actually captures it pretty well. I think the Religion of American Greatness, where he says, you believe a nation should be Christian and you believe the state should enforce it. What do you think?
Well, a nation should be Christian. That's correct. But what part of it should be enforced?
Okay.
Well, this is the problem with Paul Miller is that, no one, the thing is no one paid attention to his book. It's interesting how they say that my definition doesn't stick, even though like the only people who cite Paul Miller's book are people like him and a handful of others. No one read it. You read it, it was trashed by other people who talk about nationalism. And so anyway, but yeah, that the state should enforce it. Actually, I do say that a state can, in principle, secure a Christian way of life and order people to Christian good. But like, to me, as an American, the ideal state is that the people are Christian. Take like the 19th century, I think it was Vermont was the last state. Was the last state to disestablish its quasi, like soft established church, but still it was a Christian century. I mean, there was heresy and all that, but the people still understood themselves to be a Christian people. People reflected that in a way, the Civil War was like a theological battle among people who thought they were the true Christians, and so in the ideal state, to my mind, the people themselves have enough ordered Christian, like enough ordered liberty that is also infused with the Christian way of life, that you wouldn't need strict civil enforcement. So that's why I wouldn't agree with Paul Miller's definition, except to say that it's permissible for the state using civil power to shore up a Christian people, or to secure a Christian people. So I do agree with that. But the problem is, like, yeah, that definition actually can be deceptive as to what I affirm in detail.
Right. Fair enough. There's nuances.
So the nuances is that we would adamantly agree that you can't make Christians. You can't turn people into Christians, genuine Christians, at the point of a sword.
Right.
That's not how conversions happen. Paul says our weapons are not carnal, but they're mighty. So our weapons aren't. We're not followers of Mao, where power grows out of the barrel of a gun.
Yeah. Right.
But our weapons are mighty for pulling down strongholds. So the issue is not whether laws can make the people Christian. The issue is whether the people can make the laws Christian.
Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah.
So people will say the laws are laws don't have an immortal soul, and nations don't go to heaven when they die. So how can they be Christian? Well, by that metric, you can't have a Christian college or a Christian bookstore or a Christian, but you can have righteous laws. So you could have laws where you didn't arrest people for praying in front of abortion clinics, where you didn't allow for the dismemberment of the unborn. That's a righteous law.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So you can't change a sinner's heart with law, but you can have a righteous versus an unrighteous law.
Okay.
And we should do that. So the laws don't make the people Christian, but if you have a Christian consensus, as the late Francis Schaeffer said, then that Christian consensus can produce righteous laws.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a key point, and I wish they actually interacted with that more. When we say that a nation is Christian, we're not saying that that nation is now saved in the same way an individual is saved, or that it's redeemed now. It's a redeemed nation. I mean, you can kind of talk about that if you qualify it and have some detail on what we mean by that. But Doug is right that if you're going to say something, an entity like nation, like the nation cannot be Christian, then you can't say that a school is Christian. You can't say that a family is Christian. Right. So what does it mean to then say you have a family that is Christian? What does it mean to say you have a school that is Christian, or a nation that is Christian? What you mean is that according to the nature of that entity, take like a Christian school, it still teaches math, no matter whether it's a non-Christian or Christian school, it should say 2 + 2 = 4. It should teach mathematics. There's all these universal things it ought to teach. But in addition to that, it would also teach Christian theology and or some sort of catechesis within that school. And even more than that, the Christian element is what informs the entire system itself. Christianity is not a mere addition to some entity. It is an addition, but it's also what completes it to the whole. It's what secures the actual, the wholeness of it and makes it Christian. So when you speak to mathematics, you can speak to 2 + 2 = 4, but also in reference to God, who created all things, who made us rational beings such that we can understand the mathematics. And so, yeah, it not only adds, and so the same thing with a nation. A nation is a nation, as I've already described it. A nation is, but the nation identifies itself as Christian. It does Christian things, and the Christianity of it infuses the way of life and the customs and manners of those people, the expectations of each other. It would inform the laws and the customs. So yeah, so I think Doug highlighting this is very, very important. I remember I was going to be on a podcast and some guy asked Michael Horton. He asked Michael Horton, what should I ask Wolf? Michael Horton's a theologian. I think he's at Westminster West, and he said, at least as it was related to me through this interviewer, ask Wolf why he wants to baptize nations. Now, I don't know exactly. I think he has reference to the Great Commission. I usually don't use that verse. They do talk about this later, but it is interesting how there is this transference of individual baptism into nation, and I want to somehow make it Christian as in the same sense as an individual becomes Christian. That's really not the case. It's I believe that redemption and salvific grace applies to individuals. You can talk about it corporally as the church itself. I don't want to get into that, but I don't apply. I think that a nation is an ordering of the people to their good. So let's keep going.
This is just a comment. I'm going to interact with that as we go here. I think the term is inherently ambiguous and confusing for people.
Christian nationalism.
Yeah. I don't. It's not clicking. For some people, it is. Obviously, there's a majority of people it is. I'm not even sure in the political realm. I think it's losing steam. I'm not hearing that as the sort of main thrust of the campaigning going on. Maybe I'm tuned out, but it seems that it's an important discussion for Christians, a very important discussion for Christians. And these things we need to wrestle through. We need to think through. I am concerned at the different shades of Christian nationalism. I think you saw it at the RNC the other night. There's a masculine man up there tearing off his shirt, Hulk Hogan, which I used to have posters of, right?
That is Christian nationalism.
Yeah,
that's the definition we were looking for.
Followed by Franklin Graham to Come Pray, followed by Kid Rock. Didn't he put up the finger? I don't know. Then there was a Hindu prayer in there. My concern is, this is just initial, we don't have to, we'll let this go, is that it has no resemblance to its historical usage. And it actually is working against, at least historically, sort of political theory and free limited government.
Now, I don't know. It's interesting, as historically used. I wonder what he means by historically. I mean, it was actually historically used by people in the past, Christian nationalism. Of course, in the last 20 years, it was mainly used by people who wanted to attack Christians. I hear, but back to his earlier comment, he said something to the effect of like, it's ambiguous. It's not like catching on. The thing is, like, this is what's interesting is like, we say that, but then we are very comfortable with using words like conservative. And so when we say conservative, I'm a political conservative. What does that refer to? Are you talking about like Roger Scruton type political conservatism that you'd find in England? Are we talking about national conservatism that you find that's all about national, like industrial policy and wants to push back against neoconservatism? Is it paleoconservatism? Or I was just watching a Gavin Ortland video where he was saying that in Europe, the conservative parties are actually acknowledge global warming and want to do something about global warming. So you have to wonder, well, okay, what does the word conservative mean? We throw that around all the time. Of course, you can use it effectively, but you use it in a certain context. So if you're using Christian nationalism in the context of someone like Doug Wilson, then, well, he's written a book on it. If you're using Christian nationalism in the context of me, then, well, I've written a book on it. There is, I think, sufficient, in a way, overlap between me and Doug's position. But then if you want to read what the sociologists say about it, you read the sociologists. So I understand there's like different ways to talk about this that are at times contradictory. I would just say that's also true for just the basic word conservative. And so I just don't know if the principle is, hey, this word is ambiguous, why are we using it? Then I don't know, you kind of have to wonder exactly what else is a victim of that principle. I would say the word conservative is a victim as well. So,
but
let me agree with you there.
Okay,
but that's because with any new movement, whether you're talking about the Puritans or talking about the Methodists or talking about any movement, it takes time for the thing to set up. And what was a Puritan in 1590? Well, that definition didn't solidify until some decades later. Christian nationalism is basically a racist is someone who's winning an argument with a liberal, right? So if you advocate for the unborn because you're a Christian pastor, then for the left, you're a Christian nationalist.
Well, that's true. I mean, they're using it that way,
right? And so
it's the boogeyman.
Yeah, the boogeyman.
Right.
So Meet the Press did a story on the work in Moscow, and did a bunch of reporting and talking to people. And then when I saw the report, it was all about Christian nationalism, and we hadn't used that word once,
right?
That phrase once. So that it's a term that I can work with. And I think I can explain it in a couple of minutes, as opposed to some of the other things we get called, like white supremacist or theofascist, or I don't want to try to work with those at all. There could come a time where Christian nationalism became a useless term because it was taken over by anti-Semites I could say, okay, guys, time to throw that term away. But right now, I think the conditions are ripe for us to say yes, and let me tell you what I think that means. But I'm aware that there are alternative denominations in the Christian nationalist. There's this big thing, and there's the Stephen Wolfe contingent. There's the Gab and Andrew Torba, Andrew Isker contingent. There's the Nick Fuentes anti-Semitic, and they're all saying Christ is king. Christ has to be Lord of all. There's the Catholic integralists. So there's a bunch of...
Right, and I guess...
All right, so on the term, I have more to say of that. I've always said from the very beginning that if someone was uncomfortable with using the term, I don't care. Like, I'm not out here to make everyone put Christian nationalism on their Twitter bio. I do want people to be convinced of the ideas. And some people, after they've read the book, they said, I've always identified as such and such and not Christian nationalism, but I agree with everything you wrote in the book. And that's fine. I mean, in the end, a term, in this case, is just a term that I use to capture all the ideas I want to convince you of. If you want to call that something else, that's completely fine with me. And I have people that are on my side 100%, and they don't claim the label, and for various reasons, and I don't care. But what has happened, I think what has happened, despite the fact that it's, not everyone affirms it, has been a shift towards thinking more about people in place, the idea of going back to an older America in which we were Christian as a people. And all of that is a great development. When I see someone on YouTube or on Twitter saying something that they would not have said before, or be convinced about this or that point that would be more of an old paleo-conservative position that I've argued for, and yet they're not saying I'm a Christian nationalist like Wolf or this and that, I don't care. I don't care. I'm just happy that they are affirming these positions. That's why I've never like promoted the term. It's interesting, like when I think of a movement, I don't think there are people who claim the label, which is 100% fine. But I think of the movement as much broader than people who are just claiming the label. It's essentially a Christian new right, or a new Christian right that largely affirms very similar things. There are disagreements amongst ourselves on certain matters, from theological to political. And yet there is a type of unity of seeing we're in this together. I disagree on the on-mill, post-mill thing, Wolf, but I'm with you. I'm a theonomist, but that's okay that you talk a lot about natural law. We have to know what time it is. This is too important for us to squabble over these old disputes. And that's, I think, the movement. So I don't care to think of this whole thing, like I said, as a Christian nationalist movement under that term. And then, like when he said earlier, Chris Gordon said, "Oh, it's kind of losing steam." I don't think that's the case. I mean, maybe fewer people day to day are adopting the label. But absolutely, in terms of a more assertive Christian politics, that's absolutely still going on. That's absolutely still getting new converts. And whether it's through my work or other people's work or Doug's work or whatever it is, that's the broad movement. And so like I've always said that in 10 years or 5 or 10 years, if no one's using the term Christian nationalism anymore, but they want to have a Christian nation through assertive politics, then I think in that sense I won. I don't care. I just don't care about the term. Because really to me, the term is a description. It's a good description of the set of ideas. Nation nationalism, Christian nationalism, as I describe it in the book. As a political theory, the term is accurate. But as a political rhetorical position, you have to choose for yourself whether or not your crowd is going to like that label. They might actually be convinced of the need for Christian rulers, Christian public life, Christian laws, without you using that. I mean, it might be good that if you're presenting something to your church, if you put Christian nationals on the top, they might freak out. But if you just put Christian politics on the top, and then you cite all the enthusiasts and whomever, and then you convince them of all the positions, essentially, then that's a good rhetorical move. So I'm 100% for that, and let's keep going.
I'm worried about bandwagoning a term here that we're hitching our trailer to an elephant here that's going to cause us a lot of problems.
Good.
And I think that's a real concern for me. I personally think the whole term needs to be abandoned. But we'll come back to that. Okay.
Well, good luck.
Yeah.
So the point is we are not yet in control of terms.
Well, that's fair.
Right.
But we're in control of how we use terms.
Right.
Okay. Wilson. I'm quoting you, Wilson. I'll say
Yeah.
Wilson. All right. There's no neutrality. Jesus is Lord. Secularism is not capable of sustaining limited government. If there's not a recognized God over the state, then who has now become God? So that's sort of the premise. That's what you said on Tucker. Jared, you jump in on this. It's somewhat, to me, a fallacy of a false dilemma. If God is not over the state, is God over the state if we have a secular government? So in other words, I think you're building into the definition what I believe is a false premise, that we're in this situation that's an either or. In other words, namely, if Christianity is not in a position of power, directing all subjects according to specific Christian principles, the state is illegitimate.
No.
Okay, but
All right, so he got into something else. I don't know why, he's essentially at that last point accusing Doug of an extreme covenanter position. But so I don't know where that came from. I don't know why he would go there. But this is where I would disagree with Doug, actually. I think limited government is a product principally of Christianity, but but through Anglo-Protestantism. So I think he's right that Anglo-Protestantism, which acknowledged Christ as Lord, created cultural conditions over time for limited government that is reflected in the American founding and in the 19th century. So I agree with that. I just think that I think it's way too simplistic. It's not simply Christ is Lord over the state, and therefore you're going to have limited government. Just as a historical matter, there were governments like you can think of the Church of England and the King of England as having actually this was the reason why people fled to the New World. And that's because there was a claim, not necessarily of absolutism, but there was a claim of a lot of power, even to the point of kind of arranging certain ceremonies you have at a church. So I just think, historically speaking, that's just not the case. But I do think it is true that that ordered liberty. So I think limited government is possible under ordered liberty, meaning that the people themselves have a sense of self-government and they can then have liberty with order. The problem is when you have liberty, it turns into license. You have to check liberty from going into license through a sort of order. And that order can occur from top down or from the bottom up. And I think in the American political ethos, it has been precisely the bottom-up ordered liberty, and that was from a Anglo-Protestant culture. Okay, so yeah, he's right, but I don't think 100% right. But I do think it's absolutely the case that if you are functionally an atheistical government, an atheistical people are eventually either going to commit a sort of cultural suicide, as you see in the Nordic countries, or you're going to have, as Doug says, a form of statism that is detrimental to the good of humanity. So I do think he's right about that in terms of if you have an atheistical culture, or if the culture makers or the regime, say broadly the regime, is atheistic, at least in practice, then it's going to be detrimental. And I think what we're seeing today is essentially an atheistic culture from top down being imposed upon us. So, I think there's some disagreement there, and it's not as easy as saying Christ as Lord is then going to create limited government, because you can have a civil state that does acknowledge Christ as Lord and not have the sort of limited government that he has in mind. So I don't think that's 100% accurate.
That's how people are hearing it. So that's my question first, as you engage that. Are you saying that all governments that aren't specifically Christian, are you saying they're illegitimate?
No. We're told in Scripture that to render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's,
right,
to God the things that are God's. If it has Caesar's image on it, it's got George Washington's picture on it, it's a quarter, you can send it to Washington. If it's got God's image on it, like your children do, you may not render them to Caesar, because you must render them to God, not to Caesar. So you render to Caesar the things that belong to Caesar. And one of the things that does not belong to Caesar is the definition of who is Lord. That's one of the things that doesn't belong to him. So the Bible explicitly says, honor the emperor.
Mm-hmm.
And the emperor at the time was one of history's premier dirtbags, right? So I guess I didn't read there.
Yeah.
Pardon. He was a bad actor, and Christians were told to honor the emperor. But you honor the emperor the way God says to honor the emperor, not the way the emperor says to honor the emperor.
But your writings, Doug, aren't capturing that for me. What I'm hearing you, in Empires of Dirt, you say, essentially, the spirit has been exiled, if so. In other words, speaking of secularism as a religion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right.
So the premise then is what I'm having a hard time understanding you here say is if there's not a sort of Christian position of power, then God is not sovereign over the state. That's what I'm hearing from you.
Oh, no, God is absolutely sovereign all the time, everywhere.
Okay.
And when we have secular governments that afflict us the way they do.
So does God appoint these leaders and rulers who are not Christian? You're saying they can be legitimately appointed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What happens if, it seems to me it's the either or here, if they're pushing secularism.
No,
is that still legitimate?
You could have a Caesar like Augustus, who emperor worship really took root under Caesar Augustus in Asia Minor. But Augustus had the good manners to be thoroughly embarrassed by it. He was just embarrassed by that, and he was doing it for reasons of state. But by the time you get to Nero, people like that, they bought in. They thought they were God. And so there's a difference between an unbelieving magistrate, a pagan magistrate, whom God can use and should be honored and followed and obeyed by believers, and someone who becomes a tyrant. So,
I got that.
Okay.
I understand that. But can secularism function correctly if there's no reference to God?
If it's Christian secularism, yes.
Okay.
Christian secularism.
I understand.
So
what's interesting is that, I guess I wish I could speed it up a little bit, because what Chris I think is getting at is what if you have a system that is secular, meaning acknowledges no God at all? Doug's already said that's legitimate. So you can have a legitimate ruler who is not Christian over you that you must acknowledge and obey when the command from that emperor, that leader is just or is good. But what Chris is, I think, getting at is this idea that, well, can't a secular society, a secular ruler rule justly, and even if it doesn't acknowledge God, Now, I think as we'll proceed, what we see him, he does kind of conflate providence and other things. It's kind of weird, but I think what he's saying, he's assuming really again the neutral world period of kind of post World War II up until very recently, and saying, well, look, isn't that part of like common grace? Isn't that what is, within that period of secularism? Christians could live just well. Why don't we just fight and struggle for that and appeal to common grace? But the thing is, what's interesting is that even like the pagan societies, like the idea that your society would be over, that your society would not acknowledge some sort of divinity, is completely, at least among like the more civilized peoples, they all acknowledged some kind of divinity that was important for civic life. So, I mean, Plato, of course, Plato at the end of his laws will actually want to condemn atheists. And why is that? Because you can't have atheists. Someone who's an atheist isn't going to not obey the laws. He's going to subvert the legal system. You need some kind of system of divinities, which I would say, I think Plato and Socrates believed in divinities, by the way, but I think they did. But anyway, that you need those to have a functioning society. This was even acknowledged by the reformers and post-Reformation theologians who said that, yeah, they were false gods. Nevertheless, religion as a matter of principle, as ones that reward good and bad, were necessary for a political system. And so if you're thinking of secularism or the secular, but you're thinking in a more, a sort of neutral public space, public sphere, that is really not historically at all what the reformers were talking about when it comes to that, nor what the pagans themselves acknowledged. So we'll get more into this in a moment. So I think I think that Chris Gordon is assuming a certain period of time that I would argue, and Doug has argued, was a holdover from the post-Christian West that created neutral conditions that could not sustain itself, and we're seeing that prove out right now.
If in the medieval world there were the regular clergy, the monks in the monasteries who lived according to rule, and then the secular clergy were the ones out dealing with the hurly-burly of life. So there was an older Christian definition of secular.
Right. I realize it has different meanings in different places.
So I'm fine with acknowledging that this realm of the civil magistrate ought not to be ecclesiastical. I believe in the separation of church and state. Okay. So the state can be secular, and I would argue the state should be secular because it's under Christ. It's not ecclesiastical. I don't want boards of elders declaring war or deciding how the garbage is collected, or the church and the state must be separate. But I believe it should all, in order to maintain that, I believe it has to be under the authority of Christ.
And that might be the difference between a legitimate authority and an authority operating correctly. So any kind of secular in the sense of we don't acknowledge the lordship of Christ and we don't acknowledge the triune God, well, you would still be a civil magistrate. You'd still be a governor, city council, county commissioners, or president, but you would be the Psalm 2 type, right? You would be the kings of the earth who set themselves and take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. And then it's like the church should be witnessing you need to kiss the Son or it won't go well for you. Okay. So like it's not going to function. And Augustine toys around with this in The City of God. It's very interesting. He basically says if justice is like the hallmark of a commonwealth, then he says Rome was never a republic. Right? It's just really fascinating the way. And then he pivots and gives the idea maybe the essence of the commonwealth would be a people ordered by their loves. So he kind of takes it out of the realm of justice. So people often go to Augustine to cite this very question, is it legitimate? And I want to say, well, yes, you are the civil authority, but you're certainly not going to function well without acknowledging the lordship of Christ.
Okay. I guess I'm when I read Empires of Dirt, when I read Mere Christendom, that's not the sense I get.
Do you get the sense that we're about ready to man the barricades and declare war?
No, I get the sense that you've created this either-or situation. And I'm going to come to a point here in a minute that I want to develop in light of that. This either-or situation that if I don't think we can deny that secularism has religious things happening. You can't deny that, right? There is a religion going on. I don't deny that. There's a religion happening. But I'm concerned that I hear this either or, that without reference to God, the state will always become God. That's what I'm hearing you say.
Oh, yeah. I am saying that. The state, without reference to God, that's exactly what I'm saying.
I would say that, yeah, historically speaking, that the nations tended to conflate the civil spiritual power such that the civil ruler is deified. So that there definitely was that tendency. The idea of talking about the state becoming God is, I don't know, it's kept on like, when did the state actually arise and all that. But the idea of the civil power being kind of viewed as a divinity is, of course, is a typical pagan position that Christianity rejected. So there is, I think, truth to what Doug is saying there. But I think that the dilemma, I think what Gord is getting at is that, okay, isn't it possible that you can have a non-Christian civil order that can keep the peace, that preserves civil society, or are they all bound by their own internal contradictions to eventually fall? So, of course, all societies fall, but I think Doug's saying more than that, he's saying that if you don't acknowledge the true religion, the true God, then you are necessarily immediately going to collapse and fall. I would just say, and I think what Chris is getting at is there is at post-fall that the people themselves can acknowledge to a certain extent enough of the natural goods in civil society to actually perpetuate and preserve a civil society. Now, there's going to be full of corruption, not only because of false conclusions when it comes to natural goods. So you'll see like marriage and polygamy and things like that. But also from the fact that only by acknowledging the true God will that in a way correct and complete that nation. So if you have a school, think of a public school today, it still teaches, let's just take 20 years ago, public schools still taught the basic math and geography and that sort of thing and writing and all that. But it was still full of some degeneracy and was also incomplete. And you see where those have fallen as they are today. Now, as a Christian school, you would still teach those same things, but it would correct the degeneracy and teach theology, and it would actually complete the school itself. So I'm kind of on both positions here, and where Chris is going with it, what Doug is saying, and I'll have more to say on that idea of that we even in fallen man, even apart from the state of grace, so a pagan society has enough knowledge of what is good from their own experience to preserve society, but it will be mixed, like I said, with degeneracy and pagan worship and all that.
So if there is no authority above the state.
But see, that's the false premise. That's the false dilemma I'm trying to raise here.
Okay.
There's never a situation in which God is not over the state, even in those situations.
Yeah,
but there would be there would be a circumstance in which those civil authorities don't acknowledge him.
And that's what I mean.
If they're in rebellion against him.
Right.
I can see where I'm tripping you up. If there is no God above the state, in the minds of the people running the state, God's always over the state. There's never a time when God's not over the state.
Right. Right. There's a difference between the fact of God being over the state and the acknowledgement by the state or the civil ruler of God. And of course, that makes all the difference. That makes a difference from a family to an individual to, like I said, a school to any institution. You can have a functioning institution. Is God the God over the family? Yeah, he's the God over the family. But isn't it better that that family would acknowledge and worship God?
So when I say if there is no God over the state, in the convictions and operating procedures of the people who are running the state, if they do,
I understand that.
Okay,
I understand that.
If they don't recognize God,
I don't know that people understand that.
Okay, well that's an interesting turn that I'll have to start emphasizing that, because
I mean, you talk about like the people broadly, like I don't know his educational background, but he should know that, because are you claiming that Doug Wilson is like an extreme sort of covenanter that won't acknowledge, that says that literally no government is legitimate if it doesn't acknowledge explicitly that Christ is Lord? The majority reform position is that you can have a legitimate ruler who even in his heart despises the true God and even acts against the true God. You can still have a legitimate ruler. So I don't know if people are reading that into Doug Wilson. I think it's from their own ignorance. It's not Doug's fault. I mean, if in writing a book, and a lot of his books are, they're not 400 pages like mine, does he have to go off and say, by the way, I'm not an extreme covenanter? I just don't think. And then you have to explain what that is. So I don't think it's a fair criticism. And you see this repeatedly in this video where it's like, Doug, what you're saying here is not clear. But I wonder if it's actually just Chris Gordon's like circle, like making these conclusions that are not warranted, like trying to make Doug to be politically more extreme than he really is. When really like if I'm extreme, he's not. I don't think I am, but he's, so anyway, I think it's not a fair critique of him.
I'm a Calvinist. I'm a Calvinist from top to bottom.
Yeah. When you went to Tucker, that is not just me. That was not how I heard it said. Okay. And I don't think Tucker walked away hearing it that way. Okay. What I heard is this sort of form, we will always face the worst forms in your language of absolutism. I'll come back to that as we develop this.
I learned that from Francis Schaeffer.
Okay. Maybe I'll raise him in a minute too. Okay. All right. And I guess this is, it seems like we as Christians are just desperate to get Jesus's name in the public square. I think you saw it with the Iowa debacle. It's like, the guy goes down, knocks down a shrine. Everyone goes ballistic for about 2 minutes. Mm-hmm. And, as long as we're saying, as if this is sort of magical, Jesus is Lord, this is exactly what we want. Wolf even talks about all this stuff as sort of preparatory. He goes into much more detail than that, much more development than that. But my point is, it's like, put up the poster, Jesus is Lord. We say it. We still have the problem of nominalism. Yeah. But it seems like that's the sort of thing that we're using God's name. Philistines are backed up. Philistines are backing up Israel, and hey, throw the ark out in the middle of the field. Jesus is Lord, and we're gonna win. And they learned a hard lesson.
Right.
God will not be used this way. God will not be manipulated this way. And I fear
sometimes He will be.
Okay.
Sometimes He will be. So when the Ark of the Covenant was taken out to battle, God still spanked them. God is always sovereign. But there are many times in the Old Testament where the people turned away to idols, got themselves in a bad jam. They were afflicted by the Midianites, and they cried out to God. Yeah. And many times, God heard them.
Well, those are prayers of faith.
Yeah, that's what we're calling for.
Yeah, well, I understand that, but
we're not calling for, hey, let's do a.
There is this perception. I don't know if it was Rusty Reno in his book. He talks about sort of using even a general name of God, that's more healthy for society. And I don't see how you're not going to promote some enforced idolatry. I'm going to come back to that too. But
well, one of the difficulties in this discussion is that it kind of bounces back and forth a lot. Using Christ as Lord as in the realm of politics, I understand, like, if we're using the name of God for idolatry, or if we're using it falsely, then yeah, that's a violation of the third commandment. We shouldn't do that. If we're using that in the political context, and we're saying that our politics should be Christian politics, and that our politics is informed by the fact that Christ is Lord, then that's absolutely a good thing to use. I think there can be sometimes in our kind of exuberance, we can use this phrase, we can use Christ as Lord in a very, not combative, but in a flippant way, even if we have good intentions, we're part of some storm. So I acknowledge like that critique, and sometimes I honestly am a little uncomfortable with us kind of throwing around as like a I don't know how to describe it, like just a tool of rhetoric almost against our enemies. I think it's fine to say Christ is Lord, not only in your philosophy, but also in public rhetoric. So I guess I acknowledge in part what he's saying, and I'm not accusing anyone in particular, nor am I saying you shouldn't say on Twitter Christ is Lord. But I do think that when we do that, our hearts should be right. Otherwise, we are violating the third commandment. So again, not trying to prevent anyone from acting and doing good for the world, but just make sure your heart is right when you're using the Lord's name. Right?
Okay, let's keep going.
Is that the Strong God's book?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I want to live in a baptized civilization. That's what this is what I mean by mere Christendom. Okay, you say, either Jesus wants this or he doesn't. If he does, then are they not advocating a civil arrangement based on the will of the Lord, which would be a theocracy? Okay. That's where I think we need to think about what we're truly pursuing here, but I'll come back to that. What happens when an Islamic state forms as a result of democratic process? Here are the options. Jesus doesn't care whether the nations are explicitly Christian, number one. Number two, Jesus is opposed to the nations being explicitly Christian. Or number three, Jesus wants the nations to be I'm assuming you're number three. Okay. So once, this is all I hear in this discussion. This is what we want. This is what we want.
No,
this
it's what
is
Jesus wants.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good. Does he have a wish that's not fulfilled?
All right. Before we, okay. Excuse me. So, interesting choices there. So I think, what does Jesus want? I think we should say that Jesus wants the spiritual or the heavenly and the earthly good of his people. Okay. That's what I would say. What does Jesus want? He wants that his people are ordered to the highest good, that is heavenly life. Now it follows from that if Jesus wants his people to be ordered to the highest good, that the authorities ordained of God would then contribute within their within the limits of their power to that good. So what does Jesus want? He wants the good of his people. God ordained powers in this world, from the familiar power to the civil power, to your own individual power, and of course to the ecclesial power. So sometimes we talk of 3 powers, but let's talk of 4 powers as individuals. We have those 4 powers ordained of God. What's the end? What's the purpose of those powers? Those powers are for your good. And so Jesus wants, as a consequence of what he principally wants, the secondary want is for those powers to order the people of God to their good, which includes the highest good, namely eternal life in Christ. So that's how I would describe it. And let's just keep going. I think, again, what this goes back to, which I wish they went into more, is what is the nature and role of God-ordained authorities in relation to human good? What is the role in relation to the highest good and the inferior or the lesser goods? There's no dispute about the inferior goods, it seems, that the inferior, lesser goods are those goods that the civil magistrate and the family should order the people to. But what about the highest good? And I would say that's actually it's actually the principal role of all authority, that it would order people to the highest good.
Well, we're talking about whether it's his decretal will or his preceptive will.
Exactly. Right.
His decretal will, everything God wants is what comes to pass. But then in Thessalonians, Paul says, this is God's will concerning you, that you avoid sexual immorality. And as every pastor can tell you, there are people in their congregations who violate the will of God.
Right. But I want to know if this is prescriptive, that Jesus.
There is an interesting dynamic in this discussion where it seems that Chris Gordon will go to this providential aspect of what God decrees, this almost like the fact of things. So, but then once Doug says, "But wait a second, that doesn't make sense. We're talking about the prescriptive will of God," and now he shifts to prescriptive, and then later on he'll talk about providence and common grace. It seems very kind of muddied in the critique of Doug, and that's why it makes this very confusing. If anything, like this sort of rhetoric and opposition or criticism of Doug, I think is making is actually sowing more confusion, unfortunately. And hopefully in this commentary I can provide some clarity on that.
He doesn't just want this, he's prescribed this.
Right. Well, I was laying there, it was options. Either Jesus doesn't care preceptively what we do, or he's opposed to it preceptively, thou shalt not do that, or he requires it. Those are the logical options.
Right. So two opposed kind of presupposes that this subject is just to the whims of providence outside when it happens.
No, he doesn't care. If Jesus is opposed to it, then we should be opposed to it.
Okay.
If Jesus doesn't care, then that gives me liberty to care myself.
Right. So it's not that he doesn't care, wrong premise, right? We're deists every square inch.
Right.
We're not deists every square inch. So coming back to 3, I'm getting at the issue of commandment here. I'm getting at the issue of precept here. I want to know more than what Jesus wants. Like, I understand the distinction you made. I understand we don't have access, Deuteronomy 29:29. I understand that. I'm struggling with what is commanded here.
I think it's the Great Commission, disciple the nations. I believe that the bringing the nations to Christ, tribes, nation states, all forms of human organization, I believe the Great Commission requires us to bring them to Christ. The kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our God and of his Christ.
Now, on this point, I'm willing to have my mind changed on this. I think that I actually think that the Great Commission. I think the Great Commission is centrally the people of God, having converts and discipling them in the context of the church. That you go to the nations to make disciples. But I'm willing to be changed my mind on that. So I don't really know. This is one reason why I don't use that in the book. But as I would understand all these things, I think that the mission of the church as an institution is to make disciples of in all the nations, and eventually, through conversion, the nations themselves would, through the power ordained of God granted to nations, namely civil power, would then order that to the furthering of discipleship. Not that the state itself is doing the sort of spiritual discipleship in the context of the church. So when you say like baptize the nations, I think you can understand that as the gospel goes forth, there's conversions in nations. Let's say the king or the civil rulers become converted. They're baptized, and that's essentially what baptism is. But in effect, or the secondary effect of that is then the authority ordained of God, the civil power through which the nation then institutes magistrates, the civil rule. Then through that can be a sort of ancillary or supportive feature for the further discipleship of the nations. And also Christian nations themselves can fund missions outside of their nation to see the furthering of discipleship and conversion as well. And in terms of like the command aspect, this is where maybe Doug and I disagree. I don't think it's a command of the gospel itself to then convert nations as such. I think it's to convert individuals into the faith through which then, again, as I said before, I think the command for a nation to acknowledge the true God is really a natural command. Like it should have, all collective entities should, within the nature of that entity, acknowledge the sovereignty of God, should acknowledge God's rule over that entity. That's everything from a school to a family and to a nation. So I don't think it's a command introduced by the gospel. It's a command taken up by the gospel, and the effect of the going forth of the gospel is the baptism of the nations. And so again, I think the command is prior. So when a civil ruler is established, he acknowledges the natural good that the people are to pursue eternal life, that they are to pursue the highest good. And so he works within that God ordained power to further that to the limits of that power. Okay, so I don't know. I'd love for Doug and I to talk about this because I think that is a disagreement. I don't think practically there's a disagreement. I just think it's like where that command, like they're talking about commands. I think it's a command of Jesus precisely because it was commanded prior to I would say even prior to grace for that to happen. It's not a command of the gospel in itself. It's a command assumed by the gospel because it's prior to it, it's natural, and then it's completed by the gospel in effect. Okay.
And he shall reign forever and ever.
I look forward to coming back to that verse too.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have that on my notes, especially with you, Jared, because I heard you on a podcast.
Yeah,
I want to tackle that one soon. Okay.
Revelation.
All right.
Psalm 2, Matthew 28.
Yeah. Okay.
So we think it's commanded.
Okay. You have three sort of options. I still haven't moved to what I want to develop in light of that question here. I have a hard time because I don't know if I want to just jump into everything I want to, or I want to follow like a course here of development. And hopefully by the end, the listener will say, okay, well, at least they got to it, right? You kind of have three options. You have pluralism as one option Christians could find themselves in, right? Our situation full of pagans right down the street here. I got the Buddhist temple right here last Saturday. I've got the Congregational Church doing Gay Pride Day. Mm-hmm. And then you got the Escondido United Reformed Church preaching Reformed doctrine, okay? So you have pluralism. It's one situation. You got persecution as another situation. It's a mixed bag in history. I don't really want persecution. Right. I'm not asking for persecution. The church has flourished in amazing ways during times of persecution. But the church has also been crushed in terrible ways in times of persecution. Mm-hmm. So, you know, and you think about power then as the third option. That's what I hear you advancing.
No. So,
well,
I second the no.
Okay. All right.
Persecution, pluralism, and power.
So what about pluralism? Is that a bad thing?
Yes.
A bad situation for us?
It's a bad thing.
Yes.
Okay, so not persecution. So what are the other options?
Well, the options would be the kind of power. You could go, when you say power in the third option, it's sort of a top-down, this is the way shape up everybody. The Christian sheriff is in town.
Yeah, right. And I know you're not, you said that on Tucker, you're pushing for more of a bottom-up, although you and Stephen are different on that. And
so I think ultimately we don't, because some of the guys in Stephen's orbit grant that a Christian prince, a civil magistrate who wanted to start making reforms in a Christian way, he's going to be absolutely hamstrung after just a few days, unless there's a Christian consensus from the people. The people have got to be willing to be led that direction. It's just
yeah. I mean, you said
yeah. So I agree with Doug on this. That there was kind of an online dispute between him and me after his Tucker interview. He said there's no political solution. In hindsight, you know, it was an interview. He said a line, and then people reacted to it. In hindsight, it probably would have been better to ask for clarification because he has so much content he pushes out. So, but I agree with what Doug just said. Is that, and I think this is in Christian political discourse over the last several decades, the idea is that things are just kind of be imposed. Everything's like, here's the list of commands. You have a Christian ruler, you have the power, then boom, just enact it. That's your duty. Your duty as a Christian ruler is just to boom, enact these sort of this blueprint that we have. And now that you have the power. But politics, is more complicated, as Doug alludes to, that what a law requires, like you can have a righteous law that would be good in effect. But if that law if the people are not going to assent to the law, if they're going to run counter to the law, you can't enforce all these laws if the mass of the people just disobey it. We saw mass disobedience during the whole COVID thing, right? And they tried, and sometimes they backed off, and there was outrage and all that. And so, so any law requires there to be the assent of the people and conform to it. My only point is that we should the condition for enacting a righteous law is it doesn't require some kind of mass spiritual conversion. I mean, I'm saying that would of course be a good thing, and that would be a condition, but that's not that ultimately the condition for a law being effective, a righteous law being effective, is that the people are in a way prepared to receive that law. So, and this could be someone like people who are nominally Christian, people who are culturally Christian. And when we had Christian laws in the past here and elsewhere, there were plenty of nominal Christians walking around who assented and conformed to the law. So and Doug will later acknowledge this, that when it comes down to it, someone might not even go to church, but they were baptized when they were 10 years old. They walked down the aisle. They call themselves a born again Christian, never been back. They are prepared. They very well might be prepared to affirm and conform to a Sabbath law on a Sunday where they can't do ordinary commerce. They might not like it. They might think it's, those people are just extreme or whatever. But in the end, they're not going to outrightly disobey it. And it's not going to be mass. So they'll conform to it maybe grudgingly. And as Doug says a little bit later, then you should pass that law. If there's a righteous law that would order to the good of the people and the mass of the people would conform to that law, then you should enact that law.
You agree with the majority rules principle, and that there should be a common sort of consent.
Well, not as a doctrine. I agree with it as a practical matter of fact.
Okay.
So I believe that if you had an extremely docile group of people who weren't really didn't care much one way or another, and a Christian prince, he should do as much as he could get away with, whether a majority would have voted for it or not. But as a practical matter, I don't believe reforms can be instituted without significant buy-in from the people. So that means out of the three options, it's church planting, it's evangelism, it's discipleship.
So nothing different than we're doing right now.
Nothing different than we're doing right now.
I think it needs to be accented, Doug. I'm not. I don't think people are hearing you that way.
Italicize it.
Now, this is where I don't fully agree. Maybe I wonder if what we're doing is different between the two parties here, between Chris and Doug and myself, because I would say that what I'm doing is trying to reinstill in people a will for Christian politics, because I think, as Doug said before, there can be docile people who might obey or might affirm a law. If that's the majority, then you're not even ever going to have the power and the will to enact it. 100 years ago, having a Sabbath law, everyone just said, well, that's what Christian people do. Nowadays, people maybe Chris would lose their mind if we had a Sunday Sabbath law somewhere. There was Van Druden was asked by Kevin DeYoung several months ago, if we had a perfect Mars colony and they're all Presbyterians and everyone affirmed a Sabbath law, Van Druden even said that would be wrong to enact a Sabbath law in some Martian colony of Presbyterians. So, and a lot of Baptists would lose their mind as well, even though 100 years ago they'd be okay with it. So, in addition to discipling, in addition to preaching the gospel, you also have to remind people, look, America has a heritage of faith. What we believe now is not normal. Your gut instinct against, your kind of gut reaction to the idea of a Sabbath law is not normal. It's a product of 9 men within the Warren Court who instilled this in society, and now you've assumed it to be normal, and that's then Christian, when historically it is not. So what I'm doing is saying, yes, we need all those things they mentioned, but we also need to reinvigorate the will for a Christian political order. These things in politics is this thing. This is one of my critiques of some post-mill people. They think it's just well, if we just keep doing all these things, eventually it'll become Christian because it's part of the promise of God. But my point is that there's never going to be a time, there never was a time, it's not true now, it's not in the future, there never will be a time when political will is essential to seeing political reform and righteous laws. You always have to have the strong assertive will in the face of opposition to say, no, this is right. This is how we're going to do things. And then once it's enacted, you have to remain political to maintain it. So you can't be a conservative who just wants to grill. And then all of a sudden to realize, wait a second, they want to trans my kid. I guess I should do something about it. No, you have to be vigilant the entire time. That's politics. And we've lost that. Like Christians have lost it. They want to vote and they want to do all caps shouting on Facebook, but they don't want to join school boards. They don't want to join the institutions. They don't want to join bureaucracy. They don't want to send their very smart and strong kid to work in bureaucracy in DC. They don't want to do that. And so my point is, no, we have to do that. There has to be a recognition of political will. If you don't have political will, nothing's going to happen. And so that's what I would say to these guys. We have to understand the nature of politics, and we can't just we can't think that just that things just somehow happen. Like it's just enough conversions and it'll just happen. It'll just happen. Like we can't think like that. That's not going to win.
But with not just marking time, where we're doing it this way with this is where we're coming from, with a post-millennial vision.
Yes, I look forward to that in a minute, okay?
That's the P. It's not power.
I understand.
It's post-millennialism.
All right. We'll take your P, and I'll raise you. Hold on.
All right. So we're playing this game. We're playing the game the same way that you are. We're preaching the word, administering the sacraments, teaching people to live Christian lives. We're doing the same thing. We believe that this is going to have an impact long-term and that we're going to win. We believe that we win.
I know that's the post-millennial position.
Right. So
I believe we're going to.
Super fun.
I believe we're going to win too. But the problem is, I believe we're already winning. But I'll come back to that thought too. All right.
Hey.
So I mean, I get the sense here that actually Doug is agreeing. He's actually disagreeing with me on that. And that's that. I'm not against post-millennialism in principle. But this is, I think, one of the pitfalls and errors. There's, of course, I think Chris Gordon represents the errors of amillennialism. But this is one of the errors of postmillennialism. That, again, it's just that we're just going to preach a gospel and we believe in a promise of Christian nations. And so eventually all this, there's no clear connection between what we're doing now and having Christian nations. There's no recognition of the political will. Now, I think Doug would agree with me, but as I'm hearing him now, it sounds like he is downplaying or rejecting the power involved. I mean, civil power is a power. Civil power is a power ordained of God. It's funny how we're afraid of this word power. I mean, there's, as I said earlier, there's 4 powers. You have the individual power, there's a familiar power, there's the ecclesial power, and there's the civil power. All of those powers are gifts of God. So why are we afraid of the power? I understand as a practical, prudent idea that we don't want to be sort of obsessed with it, I guess. I don't know. But we should acknowledge that power is an element. Now, him just saying that it's only power and nothing else, I think that misunderstands the nature of politics, misunderstands what I'm saying. I think it misunderstands what Doug's saying. But we should not be afraid of power in itself. And this is really like an Anabaptist type talking point. And I think that if we're going to have Christian nations, it has to involve the use of power. I would even add a 5th power. That is social power. Social power, nowadays, for example, if you say something racist, the civil authorities are probably not going to come after you, but you'll lose your job, you'll lose your business, you'll lose your livelihood, and that's not from necessary familial power or from individual power or from social or from civil power. You're going to lose it from social power. That is the sort of social ire that's directed towards you. So anyway, there's that power as well that I think Christians should acknowledge and wield for good as well. But anyway, let's keep going. Oh,
hey, agree. We agree.
It's not a problem. All right,
totally agree.
So, yeah, I am a optimistic on-mill, very optimistic on-mill. So,
all right.
Question is, has God provided, Jared? I want to make sure I include you in this because I don't want you to feel like I'm just going after Doug here.
That's good. That's good. I'll play my role.
The thing about optimistic God mill, I guess I would say I'm an optimistic God mill as well, in the sense that I think the gospel is going to spread throughout the world. It's going to people of all tribes, tongues, and nations are going to worship God in Christ. So I acknowledge all that. What's interesting though is that if you're optimistic God mill, then you should also acknowledge the idea that once you have nations that have mass conversion, then you should also see them as using the powers ordained of God for their good. And that would involve a Christian good as well. So this is, it's so very odd to me. And he'll cite the Second Helvetic Confession later, which is just so much irony built into all this. If it's true that amillennial position is a common position in the Reformed tradition, well, those amil people also affirm Christian civil rule and Christian public order. And why is that? Well, because they saw it as, again, ordering people to the Christian good. But all right.
Yeah. All right.
Because God provided a common order where government authorities are left to his providential discretion. In other words, let's talk about natural law, common grace, just for a minute. Okay. It's not the issue providence. Here's my big problem with what I'm reading. All over the book, Mere Christendom, Empires of Dirt, there's no doctrine of common grace. I'm not reading it. I'm not hearing it referenced. That's a big problem for me in these either-or discussions. If you're not presenting any doctrine of common grace, you can see why we would land in reading you as this either-or situation. Secularism's evil. They're serving another God. Therefore, theocratic arrangement is the only answer. That's how we're reading you.
Okay.
All right. So I think this could be actually a good point against Doug. And I would probably bring this up as well. But the problem is Chris just completely misunderstands the historical argument here. Again, he's going to appeal to the Reformed tradition on this point. I just think so it is true, even though the term common grace, I don't think is as widely used in the Reformed tradition as he suggests, but I think the idea is there. But the idea of common grace is connected with natural law, is that in the fall, man lost his ability to worship God rightly, to understand higher things. And so the theology of even the virtuous pagans is going to be horrible. I mean, there are a few exceptions like Numa, and Cicero is a little better than most, and Plato's a little better than most, but it's still, the theology is going to be generally bad. It's going to be false. But because they retained natural gifts like knowledge of second table duties, and they retained the will, they retained reason, although all those things are weak. And so there's false conclusions even on earthly matters. The Reformed tradition affirms that pagans, those who are in a state of sin apart from grace, can still, as I said earlier, create civil societies that they can preserve. Okay, that can be decent societies. Of course, they're false, and they're like, as Jared mentioned about Augustine, they can still not be true republics because they're not fully just because they don't acknowledge God. But nevertheless, you can still have a Roman republic that, I mean, of course, it devolved, but you can still have, for a time, a decent civil society that maintains public order and all those sorts of things. That's just true from history. Now, the problem, I think, that what Chris doesn't acknowledge, and I said this earlier, all those countries, all those nations, apart from like the very uncivilized ones, but the civilized nations all acknowledge some kind of divinity, some kind of higher transcendent principle. They all acknowledge that those things, that the divinities had to in some way inform how you act in society, and more importantly, that they were sort of check on bad behavior, because the gods know they can see your heart. They can see the things you do in secret. They can see you defraud. They can see you be inhospitable to a stranger or to a guest. They can see all those things. And oh, by the way, they're going to harm you. They're going to go after you. Now, we know all those are false theology, but even like the Reformers, Calvin and others, and like Turretin and later, they'll say that despite all that, despite the falsity, they still functioned in society to bring order to that society to a certain extent. Now, I would argue that is the case. And actually, a lot of the errors, I would say, that were introduced into societies, like the moral degeneracy, is actually them with their corrupt theology coming into kind of disorder the civil society. So, but the point being is that Chris is assuming that the secular sort of neutrality of the last 50 years is something, a product, like a common grace, meaning that the common grace through which these natural principles came to operate properly in places like Athens and Rome and elsewhere. He's assuming that the last 50 years is like another example of all of that, when actually the last 50 years is as I said, is a product of historical conditions. It's a product of a Anglo-Protestant culture that is, in a way, post-Christian, and as we saw, it led its way into degeneracy. So actually, if you look around, the common grace of the nations acknowledged that there needs to be some acknowledgement of religion, some element of religion, as a part of the good of civil society. This is why you have reformers. Turretin explicitly does this. Actually, they all do this. They appeal to Plato's laws, as I said before, that atheism should be crushed. That's what Plato says near the end of his book of laws, on law, or the laws. And then you have Aristotle saying that you have to that the civil rulers should provide for sacred places and funding for these things. He even says in book 3 of Politics that there should be these things that are translated as pastimes. And if you look at the word, it's like festivals. Pastimes, these things are like religious elements. Like so many of the festivals they did in ancient Athens was religious in orientation. And so they appeal to these guys. And then Cicero's work on the nature of the gods, he says too that religion is a sort of bedrock foundation of society. And they appeal to these guys, Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, for this exact principle. And so it would seem, if we're going to talk about common grace in relation to natural law, then the nations, by consent of the nations, a nation ought to acknowledge divinity. And if they're going to acknowledge the divinity, then they ought to acknowledge the true God. So, and wouldn't it be better? Like we see that how, like I said earlier, how false theology can then insert itself into a society to cause all sorts of degeneracy. Well, wouldn't it be best for the society then to acknowledge the true God, and then all those degenerate acts would be eliminated through the completion of that nation? So I think that, again, I'm assuming some of the things that Chris is saying, because I think he's reflecting older Reformed views on the subject. But he's not following through with how the reformers viewed how they operated, how they viewed political society, and really how the natural law came to be reflected in politics.
Okay, I believe yours is a little more warmed over theonomy than the theonomy of a half century ago, maybe. Right. Especially when it comes to blasphemy laws, which I found interesting. See, I've read you, so
thank you.
You say secularism is relativistic of necessity because all societies reflect the nature and attributes of their God. Whatever comes into his head becomes law. Okay. The God of the system is the final appeal. Mm-hmm. Okay. I heard you say that earlier. Whatever comes into his head becomes law. Let's talk about common grace then.
All right. Yeah, I know what Chris is getting at. But again, if you're talking about secularism, then Doug is right. If your position on political order is basically atheistical or atheist, then yeah, whatever pops into your head is going to be law. I think Doug is absolutely right about that. There's a line in Turretin, I don't have it with me right now, but he basically says that first he says the nations generally are good on second table duties. That's first of all what Turretin says. But then he says, when you find really gross degeneracy, he says something to the effect of that is the product of leisure ill-used or something like that. So in other words, in order to bring in utter degeneracy into society, you have to essentially have poor leisure time in which you extinguish the natural principles that are innate to you. So Doug is actually right. I think he's consistent with historic Reformed tradition that the assumption of atheism will lead to exactly what Doug has described here.
Does the Noahic covenant have any place? Does it legitimize common governments and give them divine authorization? Does it have an effect of preserving nature?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes to all.
Okay. I'm not reading that in you. So
all right, let's talk about nature for a second. This is another issue that I have with a lot of R2K guys. That is Reformed Two Kingdom, or what do they call themselves? Radical Two Kingdoms, or I like saying them, they're modernist Two Kingdoms because they're not actually radical nor reformed. But the modern Two Kingdom guys, they'll say natural law this and natural law that. They should be governed by natural law. It's so bizarre to hear this because what is natural law? Well, if you want to know what natural law is, you can go to the 10 Commandments. Now, 4 of those commandments they concern our duties to God. And they are the first 4 precisely because that's the principal part of our duty. Our main natural duty as human beings, as creations of the Creator, is to acknowledge and worship God and worship Him rightly. That's the first 4 commandments of the law. If the 10 commandments are the summary of the natural law, then that means the principal part of the natural law is your duty to God. So if the nations acknowledge, if nations ought to then operate out of the out of the natural law, then they ought to operate out of the first table as well. And this actually goes back to Doug's point that if you acknowledge any sense of divine, so not even like it's not that they apply the first 4 wrongly. It's that if in a secular society they reject those 4 commandments entirely, then all you have left are these duties you have to man. But that's an incomplete law, and you've lost the principal part. You've lost that sense of knowing what you do in secret. You've lost a sense of knowing your heart. All you have is just what's public, and that takes on utter corruption. That will, as Doug says, will degenerate into utter social degeneracy. Okay? It's bad enough when they fail, when they acknowledge in a way the first table, and then they apply it wrongly in that sense to distort the way they apply the second table. But it's a whole different ballgame if you eliminate all 4 of those commandments and only have the final 6. And that's again, like, and really, I mean, it's so ahistorical. The natural law, whenever you hear someone say natural law, you have to know that the natural law refers to our duties to God and our duties to man. And it's not just our duties to man. And if you only live without any cognizance at all of the first table, you are going to suffer utter degeneracy of the second table. In fact, you might just simply reject the second table entirely. You're going to go, in a way, you're going to go to war. You're going to use leisure ill-employed to destroy that second table. So again, Chris is assuming a period of neutrality that was post-Christian, and I think, yeah.
So Noah has this arrangement, Genesis 9. You see the familial institution picked up from, now that the fall's taken place, now that sin's in the picture, him re-emphasizing certain things. There's no priestly function there. Mm-hmm. I don't see it. I don't see a priestly function in the Noahic covenant.
This is I think Van Druden says things like this. And I mean, they have to know that you distinguish the 2 powers, right? You have the spiritual power and you have the civil power or the temporal power. You have the sacred power, you have the secular power. Yeah. Does civil government have a spiritual power? No one's affirmed that. Even like the Roman Catholics will affirm a separation of the 2 swords. They would just say they originate from the Pope and are devolved down. We don't acknowledge that, of course, but even they acknowledge a separation. So you want to call it the priestly power. The priestly power is deposited in the instituted church. And in that instituted church is a sacred function with sacred vocations. and they essentially wield that for our spiritual good. So that means that the civil power is a temporal power, not a spiritual power. And if you want to say it's not priestly, that's probably fine. But that doesn't preclude that the use of that power in support of the operations of sacred ministry. Just like in the family. I mean, again, the family is a natural power. I don't think he'd want to say the father has a priestly function. And yet you still have a family, you still have a Christian family in which you do Christian things together. You forgive one another in Christ. You pray to one another in Christ. You do family worship together in Christ. You've essentially made a family, which is a natural entity in itself. You've made that thing a Christian entity, and you've used the power ordained by God in the family to that end, to order things to that end. So I don't understand this priestly critique, and I wish that Jared and Doug would have pressed him more on this. That it really is. It's not a good argument. Okay, there's no priestly function there. Yeah, well, so what? Everyone acknowledged that. I mean, you can say that like maybe Adam had the priestly and the sort of civil or familiar power combined in one. I think there's ways to not think of it like that, but whatever. But clearly, even if you split them into separate entities, church and state, that doesn't preclude the state or the civil power from, or any other power, whether it's familial or whatever, to order itself to the spiritual. And that's just basic Reformed political thought.
And this is where Wolf, I think, goes.
Well, he offers sacrifice.
Yeah, but that's the continuing of the covenant of grace. His faith is not separate; it's not left at the door.
But the covenant of grace has a priestly aspect.
Yeah, but the Noahic covenant doesn't itself. I think what happens in Genesis 6, as opposed to Genesis 9, something fundamental's being done there because you have it made with all flesh. All flesh is not made the covenant of grace with.
Right.
Okay, so all flesh.
Covenant of common grace.
Okay, very, very good. All right, we're making some progress here.
I do. Basically, that the absence that you're seeing, and I think you're right to recognize that I don't write a lot about common grace.
So I think that wherever you want to place this, whether it's in the Noahic covenant or wherever, there certainly was the case that civil authority was augmented. At the very least, augmented to include the restraining of sin. So prior to sin entering the world, there was no need for civil power to restrain sin because there was no sin. And so you can talk about civil power now having a preservative function because now it has the power of restraining sin. Okay, so now if you didn't have civil authority, or you didn't have the civil power with the ability to restrain sin, then there'd just be utter degeneracy. You need law, you need civil authority to do that. Now that in itself, even you want to talk about civil society or the civil power as preservative or has a preservation function, what is going to preserve society? Well, in principle, the very basic principle in part is going to be the acknowledgement of the divine. Right. As I argued earlier, this is where I think there's maybe some question begging of Andrew and other people's parts that they assume that to be preservative, again, they're assuming post-war secularism as a sort of norm. And they think, well, that could work, and therefore you don't need any sort of acknowledgement of the divine in any sense. But again, that's not how common grace operated throughout the entirety of history, right? So it always acknowledged. And so civil power then having a preservative function, preserving society from its degeneration and fall, would necessarily have some hand, at least in principle, with the divine. And I think that just follows from all the premises. And again, if you don't take post-war period as normative, as just a really historical conditioned thing, then that makes sense.
Yes, but that's simply a matter of emphasis and what I'm talking about. I don't differ with the historic Reformed view of common grace at all.
Yeah, but Doug, if you're going to engage these things, and I'm reading, and I think I'm a fairly careful reader on these things, and I'm reading secularism is a god I'm reading the either or situation. I'm reading theonomic post-mill thrust in the whole thing. It's a pretty big deal to speak about common grace because, well, under the doctrine of providence and a Reformed history, this was a major place for people. So you have these.
All right, Beerfield before, again, it was a major place in Reformed history, the idea of common grace, not the terminology, I'd say. But what did they say? They said that, again, the acknowledgement of the divine is a necessary feature of preserving civil society. So I won't repeat it again, maybe, but again, I will say that it boggles my mind that these guys who, it's like, okay, Scott Clark will list like, here's 30 theologians of the past who acknowledge two kingdom theology, right? And then you have Van Drunen do a whole book on two kingdom theology. They all acknowledge two kingdom theology, and every single one of them affirmed that the civil authority should order the people into religion, and so these guys appeal to their tradition, and I have to just wonder, like, what do they do with the fact that they're in that, for the most part, the people they're appealing to are not on their side when it comes to political order? It's always, I've never heard a good answer to that, or actually, I've rarely hear an answer at all. It's very, very odd, very, very odd. It's almost as if they can just, sometimes they'll say, oh, that's just a holdover from like medieval Christendom. They just couldn't get away from it. I have to think, like, you're telling me that for centuries and hundreds, if not thousands of people, they'll write, a 1,000-page book on theology with like citing a million different sources from pagan to Christian, and they just didn't think hard enough about Christendom? Just on its face, the argument is absurd. To reject all those people as just simply, they just had a holdover from Christendom, is just the most absurd thing you can think of. But somehow it works. Why does it work? Why does that work? A guy who's 22, 25, he goes to seminary in Westminster West, and someone says, hey, they're just theocrats holdover from Christendom. And they're just like, yeah, okay. And why would they think that? Because they've been socialized into the post-Warren Court era where all that is just somehow plausible. Like, it's so implausible to have a Christian public order that they'll accept the most absurd arguments against Christian rules. So,
you have the family institution, you have the sort of enterprise. If the lex talionis built into it, right? That's important, right? Yeah. That's built in. So when you say whatever comes into his head becomes law, and you're saying that there is a doctrine of common grace, then it seems by necessity you're affirming that they can rule in a way that honors the moral law, which is built into natural law, moral law connection, that they're going to do those things by nature written in the law. It doesn't necessarily follow then, Doug, that it necessarily means that every law that comes into his head, right, is going to be. So I'm writing these books, Empires of Dirt, Mere Christendom. I'm writing in a moment of high rebellion against heaven. Gotcha.
So if I were writing in Kuyper's day, or if I were writing at the time of the Reformation, up was still up and down was still down. The Roman Catholics and the Reformed agreed that a girl was a girl and a boy was a boy.
Sure.
So there were large elements of operative common grace. And I remember when I was a boy, there were large swaths of common grace. Up was up and down was down. Black was black and white was white. But we are living in a moment where we are shaking our fist at heaven. It is a moment of high rebellion. And when I talk about them enforcing whatever comes into their head, I'm talking about clown world. I'm not talking about how Dwight Eisenhower would make a law and pass I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the
I think that should be nuanced.
Okay. Yeah, Doug is like absolutely right, by the way. Like he's right. There are periods in history where the moral degeneracy is so bad that it's, you have to just say it's clown world. It pops into your head. It's true. I think he's absolutely right about that. I would just also state that Chris's own view, which doesn't want to acknowledge the first table at all, essentially the cognizance is gone, will necessarily lead to moral degeneration as we see today. So having kind of a longer view of history, we can see how the neutral world of the last 80 years or whatever it was essentially the beginning of what we see today. That once we get comfortable in this kind of, everyone can do what they want and it's a neutral world, and that there's no acknowledgement of God, whether in the social life or political life or through law or whatever, it will necessarily lead. So in a way, like I would say that it's Chris's theology, his political theology, is what leads to what we have today.
Then more for people.
I would be happy to.
That's not clear for me.
Okay. I'm talking about the moment Thelma and Louise go off the cliff in the car.
Okay. So you would agree.
A movie I have not seen, but I've seen that scene.
So God has this is the CRC Synod 1924. God has a favorable attitude toward humanity in general. There's a certain favor or grace of God, which he shows to all his creatures in general. God restrains sin in the life of individual man and in the community. There's a restraint of sin, according to Scripture and the confession, by the general operations of the Spirit, as he restrains the unimpeded breaking out of sin by which human life and society is made possible.
Right.
Second use of the law is another category here. Civil righteousness, as performed by the unregenerate, they can do civil good. Do you agree with those categories?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I'm currently reading Van Til's book, Common Grace, right now. That's one of the books I'm working my way through. And I agree with all those categories, but there's an additional category. God restrains unless it is time for judgment. And in Romans 1, God, what is the wrath of God? Therefore, God gave them up. So they're in the cyclic patterns of human history. There are times when God does all of those things where he restrains evil, and but then there are times when God, to punish a very wicked and impudent people, lets them go, and they run headlong. And that's where we are right now.
Okay, let me read in light of that. Belgic 13. I'll read Canons 3:4:4 and Belgic 13. Jared, jump in on this. There's a certain light of nature. No thief likes to be stolen from, right? By which he retains some notion about God, natural things, and the difference between what is moral and immoral, and demonstrates a certain eagerness for virtue and for good outward behavior, though he doesn't use it always rightly. It's a balanced presentation there. But this is where, in light of what Doug just said, on providence in Belgic 13, God leads and governs all things. Nothing happens apart from his orderly arrangement. For his power and goodness are so great and incomprehensible that he arranges and does his work very well, even when the devils and wicked men act unjustly. Okay, you might say, this time we're in is waxed this way. We're in this period of judgment. Certainly the spirit of the Antichrist has risen up. Certainly there's things happen that are like that. But notice this, that it says God leads all things well in his orderly arrangement, does his work well, even when you have the most wicked and perverse things happening.
Amen.
Okay.
Right.
We should not inquire with undue curiosity into what he does that surpasses human understanding, but in all humility and reverence, we adore the just judgments of God, which are hidden from us, being content to be Christ's disciples, so as to learn only what he shows us in his word without going beyond human limits. This whole effort of Christian nationalism seems to say, things aren't going well for us. How's it going? Things aren't going well for us. We've got to do everything we can to put the halts on the secular religionists. We've got to do everything we can to stop. And how are we not prying into the just judgments of God and his providence and even his decrees to try to stop something that God has ordained and that he will use, Romans 8, for the good of those his elect?
All right, so what he seems to be suggesting is that when there are bad times and that you interpret it as a type of judgment, that you then have to remain passive, utterly passive to whatever is happening to you. So that seems to be the principle. Now, we also know that judgments can land on individuals. Judgments can land on families. Okay, so if your family is being judged and your house is on fire, and that's the judgment of God, and your kids are upstairs, and you hear and you know there's a fire because there's smoke, and you instantly think, this is the judgment of God upon my household because I defrauded my business partner or something like that. And you think, wow, my family's being judged. And your kids are upstairs and they're about to be burned alive unless you act. You could be passive and burn up with your kids. I'm assuming that Chris and everyone else would precisely would run upstairs, would risk himself dying to save his children that they would live. I know he would do that. I mean, from what I could tell, he would do that. Even when he would acknowledge that it's a judgment for something he's done. If you're an individual and you are a sinner and you've sinned horribly, let's say you've committed adultery against your wife, and then you're driving away from there, you feel convicted, oh, that was horrible or whatever. You get in a car crash and now your car's on fire. Your car's on fire. And you think, well, this is God judging me for my sin. I'm going to burn up with the car and burn up, because if I act in opposition to this, then I am going against the just judgment of God. My guess is that Chris and everyone else would get out of the car, which means that the principle he's laid out as a general principle is false, and for good reason. You can be judged and still act to, remedy or to lessen the effect of that judgment. The point is that you acknowledge the judgment, not that you burn up with the house with your kids, nor burn up with the car in the car. The same thing with the nation. If the nation is being judged, if your neighbor down the road, who was baptized when he was 12 years old, never went back to church, is now spiritually weak, if not totally fallen, most likely, you will do nothing. You'll allow that person to suffer through the degeneracy, the social degeneracy, the messaging. You will let him be powerless to stop his kids going LGBTQ, trans, whatever. He won't have enough knowledge and I guess the will to put his kids in a private school, so he sends them to public school because that's what everyone else does. You are leaving your neighbor up. So it's like this, it's very kind of this, it's weird, as if we think of as if everyone who has it together, everyone, like, we're being judged, and so we do nothing. We as Presbyterians, we have our private schools in our churches, and people attend church and wear ties. And we have it together. We can face the judgment. Well, what about the neighbor who's like a nominal Christian or a cultural Christian? Or what about someone who's a true faith but very weak faith, who is very influenced by television? And there's no... How do you just let them suffer the worst of the judgment coming upon the nation? Or do you act in response? Do you act and say, our nation's being judged for its infidelity, and therefore we acknowledge the judgment, we repent, and we turn from our ways? And we see the effects of that judgment, and we love our neighbor, which includes ourselves, our family, and our neighbors we barely know, and want to reform things. The idea that what Chris is doing, he's just saying the judgment itself necessitates passivity in relation to the effects of the judgment. And what I'm saying is that no one lives by that principle, and it's false because it misses the whole point of how and what in fact, the judgment should bring you to action. It should bring you to call to the Lord, right? It should bring you to call to the Lord and act for the good of yourself and your neighbor. It makes very little sense to say otherwise.
It's interesting. Let me grant something that you didn't quite say, but basically is in the ballpark. There are going to be people that want to try to do this externally. There are going to be people that want to try to do this, and by externally, I should clarify, I mean not by faith. There are people who are going to be worried, fretful, and is working against the providence of God, or in some way to exert themselves as if they want to be God,
trying to defend themselves from God's decrees.
Yeah, I do think that that's a thing to watch out for.
Thank you. I mean, that's a big thing to watch out for.
But here's the key: like the way you worded everything before about, hey, the world's going to hell in a handbasket here. We are manifestly in a Romans 1 situation. I don't think there's any way to deny that people are beginning to worship the creature. They've turned their back on the Creator, and God is giving them over to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done, and that is His providence, and that is good that He's giving them over to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. But hold back those who are stumbling to the slaughter, kind of thing. You can do that in faith. Right. So the danger on the other side of the road are the people that aren't distinguishing between God's decree and God's prescriptive will. You don't want to say, well, since God's giving this nation over to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done, somebody could make this mistake. I'm not saying you were implying this, but somebody could go, well, I don't want to get in the way of God's decree, so I won't go and take a stand and speak the truth. And
that's
whatnot. Exactly
right. The question is what has He ordered for us as Christians and the church to do? That's what.
So again, now I said this before, that He kind of jumps between the decorative will of God and the prescriptive. So once an objection, like Jared just said, lands against one side, which is God decrees this, so you must accept it, Jared says, well, wait a second, we should still act. And then Chris says, well, what are we commanded to do as individuals in the church? Now he jumps back in the prescriptive side. So the argumentation is kind of all over the place, and it's shifting from one argument to the other without really kind of acknowledging and not focusing on each one as you go through. So I mean, if that's right, then if Jared is right, then even though I disagree with some of the ways he framed that, but if Jared is right, then in the end, Chris's point before is false. So
going to the motive, I agree with you completely that I must not say Caesar's being wicked. Oh no, I'm in trouble. I better fight. Okay, what I want to do is say Caesar's being wicked. Oh no, Caesar's in trouble. I've got to fight.
Now, I don't know. I heard this, and I don't know what Doug is talking about. I mean, if Caesar's being wicked and you have the power to oppose him in some way and bring about good laws, isn't that not just about Caesar, but about your neighbor? I mean, we're called to love Caesar, but we're also called to love the guy next door. We're called to love our people, to love our nation. I don't understand that response at all. I mean, it just seems obvious that if people around you are being harmed and you have the power to end that harm, then you should end the harm, not with your first thought being, well, the political ruler is good, but the good of the people being harmed. So I don't understand that response. Maybe he explains it more. I don't remember.
Now you're making me jump ahead because I think this is such an important point.
And I would underscore, that's a good way of putting it. I mean, I know somebody can post something that's crazy and wretched and then say something like, you will be made to care.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, you're pulling on people's you know what I mean? And even someone who claims that might say, well, I mean it in faith and you need to care in faith. But there are tremors of people being anxious, people being fretful, which is going to cause all kinds of problems. It really is thrown back, Chris, on what you were saying. What are we actually to expect from the Lord? And this whole, Romans 13, what does it mean that they're ministers of God? What does it mean that they're servants of God? And what does it mean that servants need to obey their masters? The Psalm 2, it's really back to what we're expecting.
Exactly. Your premise is, and I've heard Doug say it, the premise here is this is ours. The public square is ours to take back.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Prove that. In other words, I don't see how the public square is ours to take back for our purposes in light of Belgic 13.
Well, if God decrees it is.
Jesus is Lord in the midst of his enemies, ruling in the midst of his enemies, even when everything's falling.
You know what's wild? Again, I think these guys will appeal to their confessions, and I saw this and I was like, I'm going to have my little copy of the confessions, the various confessions, and so he's reading from I believe the Belgian Confession of 1561, but if you look at Article 36. He says their office, that is the magistracy, the civil government, is not only to regard unto and watch for the welfare of the civil state, but also that they protect the sacred ministry and thus may remove and prevent all idolatry and false worship, that the kingdom of Antichrist may be thus destroyed and the kingdom of Christ promoted. So it is, again, it's so bizarre. It's as if they want to affirm the Reformed tradition and they appeal to it constantly. But it's as if they just cut out that all those like things. Oh, that's just a holdover from Christendom. I don't know if Chris makes that argument, but people in his orbit do. Just cut it out. That's it. Not there. That the Antichrist may be destroyed and the kingdom of Christ promoted. Who? By whom? The civil government. The title is the magistracy. So it's weird. He'll look at. I mean, is the confession like wildly inconsistent? And then along those lines, is the Reformed tradition wildly inconsistent? As if they put these articles in their confessions and all these chapters, and it's just blatantly contradictory. That's possible. It's probably really hard to. You'd have to demonstrate it like very clearly. To show that hundreds, thousands, and all these confessional documents actually got it wrong for a very long time. So it's interesting. I think that if we should take the full tradition, and if we're going to quote one, we should quote the other.
I guess what I'm trying to say is common grace. We've established. I appreciate your saying there's common grace. I'd like to see more from you on that. I don't think I'm seeing that. Common grace is not secularism. So, Doug, you say everything, we're having terrible things happen in society. I agree. They're the just judgments of God, what's happening. We should be on our knees in prayer, and we should be on our knees in tears that these things are happening. Take the Olympics yesterday. What a terrible display, right? The confusion of Christians is you got them all riled up. Right. You may take the long 500-year view, which I'm going to come down to you back to. You may take this long view. You've got everyone worked up that we got to do this in 5 minutes, and that's what I see everywhere. These people are so worked up. They're angry. They're frustrated. They're.
All right, now we've shifted to the anger side. Hey, you hear this all the time. People who are, if we Christian nationalists were actually angry. Don't you think we would like flood the streets and break windows or something? It's very weird when they say we're angry. Most of the time online, we're just being. We understand the vibe of Christian nationalism is that you can be ironic and serious at the same time. There are some people who do kind of like nasty attacks on people and all that. So that is true. But in general, we're just having a good time. Like when I go on Twitter, to have a good time usually, and other people know that I'm having a good time. It's mixed with seriousness, but I think people who are usually older don't really understand how social media, particularly Twitter, operates, and so they think we're all angry. I've met people who are very serious about either Christian nationalism or something adjacent to it. They are not angry people. Now, are they concerned? I mean, I'm concerned. I just used the word concerned. I shouldn't have said that. You guys are going to capture that No, is there concern? I'm concerned when I turn on a TV show that my kids are watching that is just a very, very wholesome show, like, Bluey. I turn on Bluey. Oh, they like this show. This is a nice, wholesome show. And then a commercial turns on with two gay guys making out. I'm a little concerned. Are you not concerned when your kids are now watching a wholesome show that they're going to they're going to subvert it with some degeneracy in the commercials? I don't know. I could go on and on about that. you gotta wonder. I mean, there is a sort of Moscow mood where everything's kind of funny in the end. That's not my personality. I think there's humor, but in the end, if not everything is funny, but that doesn't mean you have to be angry about it, I guess. And I don't see the anger that they're talking about. I see people who want their kids to live in a country that's not trying to subvert their faith, that's not trying to make them left-wing weirdos. And they want to find ways to get with others and to influence society so that those things are no longer happening. And a lot of these people, they're devoted, they're committed. They want to influence people. They want to talk to politicians. They want to see righteous laws. But they're not out there screaming their heads off at these people in person. Their anger hasn't motivated them to throw bricks into windows. So I don't know where this angry thing is. Of course, there is an element of righteous anger, so I think at times anger would be appropriate. But to be constantly angry is simply something I have not seen in the Christian nationalist world.
They're being absolutely obnoxious in Christian witness. It's created a whole culture of what I think Paul Miller is right. It's created a whole culture of a tribal identity group, just another one in the mix that's angry.
Okay, this is. I'm glad you brought this up because one, I don't think that the Christian nationalists, broadly speaking, are to blame for people getting riled up and trying to solve it in a day. It's Big John in your second grade girls' bathroom that's got everybody riled up about what's happening. And but your point. You said ruled out.
No, it's more than that.
Well, okay. Well, what the Christian community is having to work out now is what are we supposed to do? Now, I think there are two bad options. The first option is the one you're pointing against and pushing against, and rightly so. If you're fretting, biting your fingernails and watching another episode of Fox News or the Daily Wire or the Olympics in Paris, and you're fretful and you're not actually engaged in spiritual disciplines and the health of your family and the worship of the church, that's bad. But the other bad option is to actually not engage in this moment and think about what the Lordship of Christ actually is going to mean as the kingdom of God comes on earth as it is in heaven. Yeah. Particularly this Psalm 110, you said rule in the midst of your enemies. But the very next verse of that is thy people shall be willing in the day of thy power, in the beauties of holiness. Okay, so you're supposed to offer yourself freely. We want to call the saints as pastors to offer themselves freely in the day of Christ's power, which of course Acts 1:8, like the day of Christ's power has come, and you need to offer yourselves in holiness. But I mean, the text goes on and on. The Lord has sworn, will not repent. You're a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. You shall strike through kings on the day of his wrath. So the whole vision of that particular text is the reign of the priest king, the advancement of his purposes. And that's where I think it's either going to be fretfulness on the one hand, fretfulness and fear and losing your mind, or it would be retreatism on the other hand.
Let me add something to that, because there's an important point you're making that I do agree with, because I've been around in different places in the country, and in the evangelical world, which is been poorly taught, poorly equipped. They don't have the resources.
So what I'll say about what Jared said is I guess I agree broadly. I do think that in the evangelical world, there is a sort of anxiety that can be healthy if it leads to action, principled action. At the same time, there is a tendency within that anxiety to then make your church like this sort of political, how do I say it? In other words, they want to hear political sermons every single week, and they don't actually get the gospel. They don't hear about the forgiveness of sins. They don't hear about repentance. They don't hear about that your citizenship is in heaven. They don't hear about look to Christ. They hear a lot of political sermons, kind of often mixed in with the gospel and all that, so that's fine. But so I think there is that legitimate concern that we can be so obsessed with the more inferior goods, and that we can actually let that destroy the highest good. our pursuit of the highest good. So I think that's a fair thing there, but you don't want to do the Jesus juke thing. The Jesus juke thing is that whenever you care a lot about the more temporal, inferior goods, that someone says, oh, but you care all about those things, but now you don't care about the highest good. And I would say that accusation itself is unproven most of the time, but it comes with, I think, a pastoral concern that is legitimate, that we in our concern for inferior things, we also care for the highest things. So that's my admonition to people, is don't let your concern about these things not affect that. But at the same time, we shouldn't allow that rhetoric. We shouldn't, that rhetoric, I think, is it's a fallacy. It's a Jesus juke. The fact that you care a lot about the political order is not in itself indicative that you don't care about the eternal life. Okay, it's just as a pastoral concern, I think we should make sure that we affirm and pursue the highest good while we care a lot about these lower ones.
All they have is Bruno and the girls' showers, and they're freaking out. If I were a Machiavellian, I could build a huge website catering to evangelicals that was just fear porn. Oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no.
I mean, that's one of my main concerns here.
Okay, but let me share the concern and point to something in Moscow.
So the thing is about this, I mean, if you're someone like myself and you do politics and your concern is politics and you write about politics, I'm not a pastor. I don't feel any need to balance my engagement with spiritual things, with pastoral things. But pastors should, ordinarily, right? So if you're looking to Wolf for a bunch of like spiritual advice, or if you're looking to me as like a pastoral figure, I don't do that. I study politics. I read here's one thing I'm working through now. I'm reading stuff like this. Defense of the Peace by Marsilius of Padua. I'm reading these things, like I'm reading politics and I'm communicating politics. If you think that I am a one-stop shop for everything, you're going to be disappointed. Hopefully you would be if you think I am. But that being said, there are and should be other people who are doing the pastoral concerns, who are admonishing you to, okay, you like what Wolf is saying. That's good. It's good that you care about your family. It's good you care about civil society. Your activity is good. Your protesting abortion clinics is good. All of that is great. But as a pastor, let me make sure that you are, in addition to that, holding your first heart for Christ and for the life to come. That's great. That should happen. Pastors should be doing that. Even friends who know you personally should be doing that. But I would say to these guys, let people who do the politics, who think deeply about law, who like civil order and all these things, let them do that, and don't kind of Jesus juke in them to saying, oh, you need to balance your stuff with like stuff that pastors do. And I think that's missing the vocations. It's missing that any movement is going to involve different people doing different things. It's actually a very evangelical thing to want to have like a one-stop shop on everything. That's why they often look to their pastor to be not only their minister, but also their political movement leader, to also the guy that tells them what is a just and unjust law, to guy to tell them, tax rates and this sort of thing. I think we need to get away from that, and we need to kind of diversify people's vocations in relation to your life. I'm doing one thing, other people doing other things. And some people, like Doug, seems to be able to do it all, and that's fine. I can't do it all. So look to a variety of people for your various needs.
Where we've been working at building a Christian community for decades, the demeanor is 180 degrees out from that. We have happy families. It's characterized by psalm singing. It's characterized by feasting, by joy, by Sabbath dinners, by exuberant worship on the Lord's Day.
Reading Herodotus.
A liberal arts education. So basically, if you drew a caricature of an evangelical couple that go to a big box evangelical store, but church, but the store, but they don't like what they see in the news, and they're susceptible to the fear porn, and they react to it. They react to it. I know what you're talking about, and that's not what we're doing.
Yeah, but your writings and the writings of others are doing that. So
I don't think so. Because
I'm going to quote. Let me quote here.
Okay.
Toby. Let me quote Toby for a minute. Our culture, the Christian West, what is left of it, is in the last gasping hours of stage 4 terminal cancer. Secularism has metastasized, and it's all in our organs and lymph nodes. And then he goes, so if anything, we're not pugnacious enough. We're not fierce enough. And if I quoted Ben Crenshaw here, which you gave another one. I want to see a return to political Protestantism that can rule a nation wisely through civil law, fashion, rhetoric, technology, and more. Alternative cultural movements are fine for now, but at some point, Christians in America will have to get comfortable with becoming explicitly political again and taking the reins of power in Washington. Wow. Okay, so you'll have to convince me here. That's my mission as a Christian. I still haven't followed through. I'm already jumping down, but there's nothing you guys like, killing cancer with a little civil war. That's the language.
You notice how he jumps from the idea that we need to be comfortable ruling to civil war. It's interesting that that's where he goes. If you reflect on the last 20 years, we had basically cultural revolutions happen in a series in this country from minority rule. I mean, this thing of the transgender thing. So over the last 10 years ago, people were kind of talking about it was still weird. They were, those people are in San Francisco doing their drag shows. But now if you oppose Drag Queen Story Hour, you think you would call a guy in a dress, you call him a he, you'll be fired from your job. And who imposed that upon society? Well, it was a committed minority of people. And it was basically without bloodshed. I mean, that's one of the remarkable things about modern liberalism is that you can, through the very apparatus of power, you can actually impose a sort of vision on people. Now, I'm not saying that Christians can do that now, but it does recognize something important about politics and that the broader principle. And that is that the committed minority, the people who care the most, are the ones who succeed. If you don't care, if you're just going to grill and watch the football, you're going to get trampled over. Because the people not grilling and not watching the football, they are the ones who are going to impose the change upon you. That is the nature of politics. It always has been and it always will be. And this doesn't have to happen through a civil war. I don't know anyone, including myself, no one has claimed that we need to take up arms right now and go storm the Capitol and take over and use arms. I think he's kind of grossly misinterpreting both what Ben Crenshaw is saying through an excellent essay, by the way. You should read that. You should read anything by Ben Crenshaw. And Ben is right. We have to be comfortable, as we were in most of American history, be comfortable with a Protestant dominance in the country. It was a culture of Anglo-Protestantism that gave us ordered liberty. You see how liberty has devolved into license? It's because that ordered liberty, what undergirded that was a historical Anglo-Protestant culture. And now it's being eroded, it's been destroyed, and now you have utter degeneracy, you have disorder, and disordered liberty leads to license. This is what we're seeing today. So, it's very, I don't know. So another thing too, is I would agree that our churches don't have to turn into political action committees. I think there should be some politics from the pulpit and all that. But people doing politics is often, like I said, it's my minority of the broader group. So the majority of evangelicals affirm a certain set of doctrines, and they would go along with our political principles and laws and all that. So you just need a dedicated minority to be the political actors to see that vision from evangelicals enacted in the world. So you don't need a mass sort of democracy necessarily. You do need some socialization to what's true, what's false, what's good and evil. You don't have to get everyone kind of sort of riled up all the time, but you do need them to have at the basic level a will for Christian order, and then you need that exceptional, dedicated minority to see it happen. And that's just how politics is. And if you don't do that, you are going to lose. And by lose, I mean, you're going to see this sort of degeneracy that we see today. So I think the whole analysis is just utterly false. It's attributing, again, it's like a sort of Jesus juke where people are political, and so therefore they're actually missing the highest good. And if you're ever going to make that, as I said earlier, if you're going to make that sort of critique, you should open it up with, I acknowledge the importance of your concern for society.
So come on. I mean, this is the kind of rhetoric that's stirring up everyone. Now, you may have joyful families in Moscow, but don't you think, you guys, that the perception is we're putting all this writing out there. We're sort of the spearheads of the defenders. You've been known as the most controversial pastor in America by Tucker. That essentially that this is a sort of implicit call. We have the answers in Moscow to the problems that are happening. And you give this great perception out there, catastrophic postmillennialism. I think that's the Rushdoony position. A catastrophic postmillennialism is going to happen. We're almost there. Get on board now. You've stirred everyone up this way. That's what really concerns me.
It's a eucatastrophe, to use Tolkien's phrase. Things are really dire. They really are. And you're right to point to our rhetoric is combative. We do challenge. We do. That's all true, and I wouldn't want to back away from it. But I'm in a privileged position in that when people move to Moscow, as many people do, or when I travel and I meet people who've been reading me for years, and I gauge what kind of people they are, what sort of Christian likes what I do, what sort of Christian tracks with what I do, and there are people who move to Moscow and who are disappointed and disgruntled and leave. But overwhelmingly, the people who are responding to our messaging, if you wanted to put it that way, are sane, clothed, and sane, and in their right minds. They're not crazies.
This is important. I want to underscore. I've been in Moscow for almost 3 years now, and I've come out of a world of evangelicalism that actually is quite extremely susceptible to the thing that you're talking about. Very susceptible. Conservative, evangelical. I actually wrote a piece on this. Three communities that you can be involved in. I said separatist pietism will be one community, defensive evangelicalism will be your second community, and the third would be some kind of reformed Kuyperianism deal. So there is absolutely a defensive evangelical movement that is going to be quick to jump on the Trump train and quick to look for some kind of political solution. We've actually been repeatedly saying there is no political solution. I think you have a message coming up, and I've already said that publicly several times. But this is why this one's so important, because there is a huge problem on the other end of a separatist pietism position. That in what happens.
So I'm probably gonna end it here, but in maybe 10 minutes. But I don't understand this just outright rejecting a political solution. If you mean the solution is only political, I just wonder what exactly what is the argument here? Is it the post-mill argument that we just do the spiritual things, and then based upon the promise of postmillennialism, this will bring about the reformation of society? We just kind of do these spiritual disciplines, preach the gospel. Now I know they don't believe that, because they have people who are running for office in Moscow. So I don't fully understand the argument. Our problems today are political problems, in the sense that certain moral degeneracies are sanctioned by the state and promoted. Okay, and so those have to be eliminated. And also, it's just the fact, again, I've said this before, most people are average, right? Most people are average people. The people in Moscow going to Christ Church, they have it together. I mean, I know you know what I mean? They're among the Christian world exceptional in their piety and their commitment to, doctrine and Christian life. But most people in the world are just average. Most people are the sort of people who will conform. I mean, just take like the gay marriage thing. Like 20 years ago, like 60, 70% of people were against gay marriage. Barack Obama in 2008 ran against gay marriage. And now it's like 70, 80% of the people are pro-gay marriage. Most people are just going to assume the common culture of the society. And that even includes people who have a weak faith. People go to these mega churches downtown. They are easily influenced. Now, if you have a combative influence, combative posture, as they do in Moscow, Idaho, you're going to easily, among your people, condemn all that. But again, most people are going to be influenced by these things. Now, that means that in part you have to have a society, a social life, and political order that is a sort of tutelary, that teaches people what is good and what is bad. We kind of had this in our social life for a long, long time as the outgrowth of Anglo-Protestant norms and culture. And that gave us, as I said, the possibility of ordered liberty. But what we have now is the exact opposite of that. So I don't think we should exclude the political. There is the discipleship, there is the preaching the gospel, there is all that. That is the function of the church, the principal function of the instituted church. But the people of God in their secular vocations, in their political and social life, should seek that this social life is ordered through our enforcing our good social customs and through good civil law. And in that sense, it is a political solution. There will always, I mean, you can never escape the political. You will never have a condition such that you don't need politics. You will always need politics. And this is, again, where I want to push back on some people who are post-mill. I know many people who follow me are post-mill and agree with me, but that is the danger on that side. All right, well, I'm gonna kind of leave it at that because it's getting. I've been doing this for like 2 hours, I guess. There was a super chat. Someone did do a super chat. I'm trying to figure out how I can add this to the screen. I'm not really sure how. I apologize. Someone named Anon put this out there, and I don't know. So I will mention the question. The question is about the Christian Prince. Question is, between George Washington and Oliver Cromwell, which one was more of a Christian prince, of what a Christian prince should be? So that's a very, very interesting question. I mean, so the good thing about Oliver Cromwell is that he explicitly acknowledges that God should be over the state. But at the same time, so there's good. That's good there. He acknowledged the Christian component explicitly for political order, and sought to order society according to, or to make it Christian using political power. So all that is very good. The problem, I mean, in hindsight, though, thinking about the English Revolution or the English Civil War, is that reign didn't last very long. I mean, he died and then everything fell apart fairly quickly afterwards. And so was Oliver Cromwell successful in the long run? Well, it depends on, I guess, where, if you want to think of his influence as it reflected the New World. But when it comes to actually in English society, it did not actually last. So in that sense, you wonder if there was prudence involved in that. So that's a very good question. But then if you compare him to George Washington, there's a very different situation. You do have a guy who explicitly acknowledged that nations ought to acknowledge God. He says that. You look at his Thanksgiving proclamation when he became president. He did a Thanksgiving proclamation telling the people to have a fast day in order for this new nation together. So read that. In the very beginning, he says, whereas nations ought to acknowledge God. And since he was a Christian, at least culturally, that God for George Washington was the Christian God. So he's essentially saying that the people themselves as a nation ought to acknowledge God. And this act in the churches of acknowledging God is acknowledging the triune God, is acknowledging the true God. So he did, but he also did that in the context of America, in which there were different colonies with different legal traditions, in a way, different relationships of church and state. at that time. So some places had a, somewhat soft establishments, not like hard establishments you find in the Church of England, but they had soft establishments. And so he's giving a general Christian proclamation for the nation to acknowledge God through this collective fast. So, and our nation survives kind of to this day. And throughout the 19th century, everyone understood, and well into the early 20th century, we Americans acknowledge ourselves as a Christian people. So the question is George Washington wasn't as explicitly Christian and called for a Christian political order as much as Oliver Cromwell. But in the American context, it worked remarkably well for a long time. Okay. It's a difficult comparison because it's in different context. One guy was less explicitly Christian, though he, like I said, established an order that lasted a long time. George Washington, by the way, he didn't agree with James Madison on disestablishment. So James Madison wanted to disestablish Virginia, which eventually did occur, partly from his influence in Thomas Jefferson's. He opposed Patrick Henry. That is, Madison opposed Patrick Henry, and Washington essentially supported Patrick Henry's bill to fund ministry in Virginia that Madison opposed. So George Washington did affirm the type of soft establishment that Patrick Henry wanted, which was the sort of establishment you had in New England from Vermont to Connecticut and to Massachusetts and elsewhere. So in that sense, I've always said that in terms of the American Christian prince, George Washington is a great model. He's a great model because he did affirm God should be, over the state in explicit terms. He did support soft establishments. And he was, at the very least, a cultural Protestant who assumed that our country would continue in cultural Protestantism. So in terms of the American model, I always point back to George Washington. In other places, George Washington would not be suitable. And so they would look to some other figure in their political history. I think we as Americans, it'd be best that we would look back into our history, as specifically American history, and look for models of Christian rulers as we go forward. And so again, I would say George Washington. But all right, well, I'm going to end it there unless there's like another super chat. No, there isn't. Okay. I've been talking for like 2 hours. This has been great. I hope the sound's been okay. I turned off the sound because there was an echo, and I know it's actually registering through because I can see it on my screens. I apologize if the sound's not as good. I will post this later on as a separate video, and so if you kind of ducked out because the sound's bad, well, hopefully you're listening to it again because I was able to edit it and make it better. But anyway, so if you have any suggestions for improving these live streams, you can comment or send me a message, an email, which you can see my email, my Twitter handle, Stephen with a PH at Wolfshire, wolf with an E.com. And so leave it at that. I will. This is part one. I think I got through about an hour of this. I want to go through the whole thing because it's making me think. It's allowing me to articulate my positions, and we'll move along through that in part 2 or 3. All right. Well, thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day.